The house on Fifth Avenue is dark by 10, not because anyone has gone to bed, but because the woman who lives there has stopped lighting the upper rooms, one by one, over a period of months, the way a person stops setting a place at a table for someone who no longer comes home. 2 miles north, in a narrower house with narrower windows, a lamp is still burning. It sits on a small writing desk beside a stack of unopened correspondence and a single photograph turned face down. The woman in this house is younger. She has been called many things by the newspapers of this city, and almost none of them have been her name. Neither woman knows, on this particular night, which of them will be remembered. Neither woman knows which of them will still be alive in 1964, when the century has turned twice over and the mansions on Fifth Avenue have become department stores and parking lots. This is not, in the end, a story about scandal. It only wears that coat for a while, the way a house wears scaffolding during a renovation, something temporary clinging to the outside of something that will outlast it. It is a story about waiting, about the particular patient arithmetic of women who are told in every possible language of law and drawing room and dinner party silence that they did not belong at the table, and who simply arranged, over the slow accumulation of decades, to be the ones still sitting there when the table was finally cleared. Outside, the city keeps its own late hours. A carriage passes somewhere below, wheels finding the seams in the cobblestones, the sound rising and fading the way sound does when a street has mostly gone to sleep around it. Neither woman in either house hears it particularly. They are both listening to something quieter, something with no sound at all, the slow accumulation of years that neither of them can rush, and neither of them, yet, fully understands she is already winning. You're in New York, somewhere in the long amber stretch between the Civil War and the First World War, in the decades that history would later name for their gilding rather than their gold, because the gold, it turned out, was only ever a thin layer over something more ordinary underneath. You already know the shape of this world if you have spent any evenings inside it. The 400 families, the Newport cottages built for 8 weeks of summer use and left cold the other 44, the 300 gowns worn once, the husbands who left, and the wives who were left to discover, usually too late, that the fortune they had spent their lives displaying was mortgaged down to its doorknobs. But there is a second household in almost every one of these stories, and history has been slower to let you inside it. Down a side street or 2 neighbourhoods over, or across an ocean entirely, there is a smaller house with a woman inside it who is not the wife. She has a different name for herself depending on who is asking. A ward, a companion, a niece by courtesy. The newspapers, when they are being polite, call her a friend of the family. She did not marry into the fortune, she was not born into it. By every rule the century had written down, she was not entitled to a single dollar of it, and the men who wrote those rules made certain, over and over, that the entitlement never arrived by accident. And yet, something in these stories keeps refusing to end the way the century intended. Some of these women simply waited. They stayed near enough, long enough, patient enough, that when the wives died and the sons squandered, and the trustees embezzled and the panics came, as they always came, there was still a woman standing quietly at the edge of the room who had never once touched the principal, who had been given her jewels, her townhouse, her small fortune years earlier, as gifts, freely, irrevocably, before anyone thought to ask whether it was fair. A gift, under the law of that century, belonged to the person who received it the moment it left the giver's hand. An inheritance could be contested, litigated, drowned in the debts of a dead man's estate. A gift, already given, already spent, already sitting in a woman's own name in her own house, could not be unwound by a creditor arriving 5 years later with a ledger full of bad news. This is the quiet mechanism at the centre of tonight's story, not scandal, arithmetic. The arithmetic of who receives money while a man is alive and can still choose to give it, versus who is left waiting for money after he is dead and the choosing is over. Tonight you will meet 3 women who lived on the far side of respectable society. One of them became, by the plain measure of dollars, one of the richest women in the country, though for decades no history book thought her worth mentioning by more than a sentence. One of them was written out of a will entirely and discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that being written out no longer mattered, and one of them did everything the other 2 did and still lost, which is worth remembering too because not every story of patience ends in triumph, and the ones that do not are just as true. Let the wind outside settle, let the gas lamps along the avenue burn low and gold. We're going back to a Richmond boarding house in the 1850s, to a girl whose father is already dead, whose mother is already taking in strangers to make the rent, and whose name will one day be carved into the stone of a library in California that neither of them could have imagined. None of this will be loud, none of it needs to be. The women in this story spent their whole lives learning that the quietest room in the house is usually the one where the real decisions are made. You might already sense from the shape of the century you have visited before tonight how thoroughly it organised itself around the idea that a wife's claim was the only claim worth protecting. The law wrote her into every document. Society seated her at the head of every table she was permitted to host, and yet the very thoroughness of that protection made it brittle in a way nobody intended. A claim built entirely on paper can only ever be as strong as the paper itself, and paper, as you have already learned, burned rather easily in this particular century. The women waiting outside that protection had no paper to rely on, and so they built something else instead, almost by necessity. They built proximity, they built patience, they built, in a handful of remarkable cases, an entire second architecture of security that ran alongside the official one, invisible to the census takers and the society columnists, visible only in bank ledgers and property deeds that nobody thought worth cross-referencing until decades later. It is worth remembering, as you settle in for what follows, that none of these women set out to prove a point about the fragility of Gilded Age marriage law. They were not economists, they were not reformers. They were, each of them, simply trying to survive a century that had already decided, long before they were born, how little consideration it intended to give them. That survival took different shapes. Sometimes it looked like nursing a dying woman with genuine tenderness, never once calculating what might come after. Sometimes it looked like quietly accepting a house, a necklace, an allowance, and asking no questions about what any of it meant. And sometimes, as you will see before the night is through, it looked like fighting loudly for what a woman believed she was owed, and losing everything for the trouble. Consider, before we begin properly, the particular texture of an evening in this world. Gas lamps rather than electric ones in most of the households you will visit tonight, at least in the earliest years. The soft hiss of a flame behind glass, casting a warmer, less certain light than anything electric would later provide. Carriages rather than automobiles for most of this story's span, their wheels finding every seam in the cobblestones, their pace slow enough that a conversation could unfold in full between one address and the next. This is a world that moved more slowly than the one that eventually replaced it, and it is worth letting that slower pace settle into your own body now at this late hour as we prepare to enter it. There is a particular kind of silence too that belonged especially to the households you will visit tonight. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, but the charged, careful silence of women who had learned exactly how much they were and were not permitted to ask. A silence maintained at breakfast tables, in carriages, across dinners attended by 50 guests who all understood, without anyone saying so, exactly which questions belonged to the evening, and which did not. You will hear that silence throughout tonight's story, in the gaps between what these women knew and what they were allowed to say aloud. The night is long enough to hold all three versions of that survival. Let it hold them now, unhurried, the way the century itself unfolded, not in a single dramatic year, but across decades, in rooms that mostly nobody was watching. Before the three stories properly begin, it is worth saying a brief word about how a story like this one gets told at all. More than a century after the women at its centre have died, and the newspapers that once scandalised them have long since yellowed into archive boxes nobody visits anymore. History, especially the history of women who lived outside the formal, well-documented channels of marriage and inheritance, survives in fragments. A property deed here, a newspaper account there, filtered through the particular prejudices of the reporter who wrote it. A memoir published decades later, shaped as much by what its author wished to remember as by what actually happened. Piecing together a coherent life from these fragments requires a certain amount of careful, honest inference, filling the gaps between documented facts with what the surrounding context makes reasonably likely, while being scrupulously clear about where certainty ends and reasonable supposition begins. This story has tried to hold that line carefully throughout. Where the record is clear, a marriage date, an inheritance figure, a death recorded in a newspaper obituary, this account has stated it plainly. Where the record is thin or contested, as it often is for the earliest years of women whose lives only became historically significant later, this account has said so, rather than manufacturing a false certainty simply because a smoother story would have been easier to tell. It is worth remembering, too, that the very fact of these women's obscurity in most historical accounts is itself a kind of evidence. Men who built railroads and libraries get biographies. Women who nursed dying wives, who lived quietly in Park Avenue mansions, who sued and lost and were forgotten, tend to appear in the historical record only as footnotes to the men whose fortunes intersected with their lives. Reconstructing their stories with any real texture requires reading against the grain of sources that were rarely interested in them as anything more than scandal or curiosity. That work has been attempted honestly here across the long night ahead. What follows is the fullest, most careful account this particular telling can offer, built from what actually survives, arranged into the shape of three lives that mattered enormously to the women living them, whatever the century chose to say about them at the time. One last note before we begin properly. Where a specific fact remains genuinely disputed among historians, an exact birth year, the precise nature of an early relationship, a detail no surviving document fully settles, this account has said so plainly rather than choosing the more dramatic version simply because it makes for better telling. Where the record is clear, it has been followed closely. Where it is thin, the thinness has been acknowledged rather than papered over. That is the standard this history has tried to hold itself to, across every hour of the long night now finally ready to begin. There is a version of the Gilded Age you already know, and it is mostly a story about wives. The wife who spent 30 seasons hosting dinners for a fortune that turned out to be heir. The wife who married a title and discovered the title came with debts instead of a palace. The wife who drilled open her own husband's safe because he had never once shared the combination. You have heard those stories, or ones very much like them, because they were the stories society was willing to tell about itself. A wife's ruin was tragic, but it was also respectable. It fit inside the frame of marriage, inheritance, and law that everyone already agreed was the proper shape of a woman's life. The other women in this century do not fit inside that frame, and so their stories were mostly left outside it. They appear in the newspapers as footnotes to men, a ward, a protégée, a young woman of uncertain family whose townhouse nobody could quite explain. History, when it noticed them at all, noticed them the way it notices weather, as an inconvenience that happened to somebody important, rather than as a life with its own patient logic. It is worth naming that frame plainly before we step past it. A wife's story was legible to the century because it fit an existing template. Virtue rewarded or virtue betrayed, a familiar shape society already knew how to feel about. The women waiting outside that template required an entirely different kind of attention, one this history is only now, more than a century later, finally prepared to offer them. But look closer, across three very different households, and a pattern begins to surface that the century never intended anyone to see clearly, because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting something uncomfortable about how fortunes actually moved through Gilded Age families. The pattern is this. A wife's claim on a fortune ran through the law, through wills, through coverture, through trusts managed by men who answered to other men. It was on paper the stronger claim, but paper claims could be buried under decades of concealed debt, and by the time a widow discovered what she actually owned, the estate itself might already be a shell. A mistress's claim on a fortune, by contrast, ran through nothing but the ordinary generosity of a living man who could give her whatever he liked, whenever he liked, with no court and no trustee and no waiting for his death, a house deeded outright, jewels placed directly into her hands, cash deposited in an account that carried only her name. None of it required his permission after the fact, because his permission had already been spent at the moment of the giving. It is a strange, almost accidental fairness buried inside a deeply unfair system. The women furthest from the law's protection were, in a handful of remarkable cases, the ones the law could least reach backward to undo. You will meet Arabella first, because her story is the largest and the longest, stretching from a Richmond boarding house through 2 marriages and 2 fortunes, and into a library that still stands in California. its shelves lined with books that once belonged to a woman the old New York families refused for decades to receive at their dinner tables. You will meet Emilie next, a girl of 16 when a 63-year-old transit magnate first noticed her, and a woman of 77 when she finally died in England, 59 years after the man who built her a mansion, having spent nearly 6 decades of a life that the newspapers of her youth had already prematurely written off as ruined. And you will meet Josie last because her story complicates the tidy shape of the other two. She outlived the man who kept her by nearly 60 years as well. She was showered with the same jewels, the same brownstone, the same careless generosity, and she still lost almost everything that mattered, which is a truth worth sitting with as much as the triumphs are. None of these women asked to become case studies in how money moves through a family across half a century. They were simply living, one ordinary decision at a time, inside a world that had already decided, long before they arrived in it, exactly how little they were owed. What they discovered, in different ways and with different endings, was that the world's decision was not quite as final as it looked on paper. Fortunes are not only made, they're also, patiently, quietly, outlasted. It helps, before we go further, to understand exactly how rigid the formal alternative was. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage across most of this century, a wife's legal existence was folded entirely into her husband's the moment she married him. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not, in most states, own property outright unless a specific statute carved out an exception. Her claim on her husband's fortune existed only in the shape he chose to give it. In a will he could rewrite at any hour of any day, right up until the hour he stopped being able to hold a pen. A mistress, paradoxically, existed entirely outside that legal architecture, which meant she also existed outside its restrictions. She could, in principle, hold property in her own name far more easily than a wife could, precisely because the law had never bothered to design a framework controlling her. Society controlled her instead, viciously and constantly, but society's control and the law's control were not the same instrument, and a woman who understood the difference could sometimes slip through a gap that a wife, bound tightly by both, never could. This should not be mistaken for an argument that the mistress's position was preferable, or that any woman in this century would have rationally chosen it. The social cost was severe and largely permanent. What is being described here is narrower and stranger than preference. It is simply an accident of legal architecture, a loophole nobody designed on purpose, discovered independently by different women in different cities across several decades, each of them arriving at roughly the same quiet strategy without ever comparing notes. Think for a moment about how differently a family's fortune might travel depending on which side of that loophole a woman happened to stand. A wife waited for a will to be read, for an executor to finish his accounting, for creditors to take their share first. A woman standing outside marriage collected her security in small pieces over years, each piece already final the moment it changed hands. One path ran through the courts, the other ran quietly around them. You will notice, as tonight's 3 stories unfold, how consistently this single structural fact shapes everything else that happens to these women. Not their character, not their choices, not even really their luck, but simply the plain mechanical difference between a promise and a gift already given. It is worth saying plainly, too, that none of these 3 women knew about each other. Arabella never met Emilie. Emilie never met Josie. They lived in different decades, different cities, different social circles entirely, connected only by the accident of having each, independently, discovered the same narrow structural gap in a legal system that had never intended to leave them any gap at all. History rarely arranges its lessons so conveniently, and it is worth resisting the urge to imagine some hidden network of women passing this knowledge quietly between them. There was no network. There was only a pattern repeating itself 3 times across roughly half a century, because the underlying mechanics of Gilded Age law and Gilded Age money did not change quickly enough to prevent it from repeating. There is a gentleness in that fact, oddly enough, at this late hour. These were not calculating strategists comparing notes over tea, plotting their way around a century designed to exclude them. They were simply women paying close attention to their own circumstances, the way anyone in a precarious position learns to pay close attention, and arriving, each in her own time and her own city, at broadly similar conclusions about where safety could actually be found. Some found more safety than others. That too is part of what makes this story worth the telling, rather than a simple, satisfying fable about clever women outwitting an unjust century. Life rarely resolves into fables. It resolves more often into the specific, unrepeatable texture of one woman's choices meeting one particular set of circumstances, sometimes rewarding patience and sometimes not. It is worth understanding, too, just how common this general arrangement actually was across the great cities of this century, even if only 3 examples are gathered here for you tonight. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and later London and Paris all supported, quietly and at every level of society, an entire shadow economy of households like the ones you're about to visit. Not every one of them ended in fortune. Most, in fact, did not. Most of these women lived and died in obscurity. Their names never recorded in any newspaper, their small securities, if they managed to build any at all, modest and unremarkable rather than headline-worthy. The 3 women in tonight's story are, in that sense, unusual, not because their situation was rare, but because their situations happen to intersect with fortunes large enough, and men careless enough with public appearances, that a historical record survives at all. For every Arabella whose story can be traced through library archives and estate filings, there were surely dozens of women whose entire lives passed through exactly the same arithmetic, unrecorded, their names lost along with whatever modest security they managed to accumulate. This is worth remembering not to diminish the 3 stories ahead, but to place them properly in scale. They are not anomalies plucked from an otherwise orderly century. They are simply the visible tip of a much larger, much quieter pattern that the respectable historical record mostly declined to preserve, because preserving it would have meant admitting how thoroughly this supposedly rigid, rule-bound society actually depended on arrangements it refused to officially acknowledge. There is another way to think about this pattern, one worth holding on to as tonight's stories unfold. Every society builds a public architecture of rules, its laws, its churches, its polite fictions about who may love whom and under what circumstances. And every society, alongside that public architecture, builds a private one as well, unspoken, unofficial, but every bit as real, governing what actually happens behind the doors the public architecture pretends do not exist. The 19th century was, in this regard, no different from any other. It simply built its private architecture with a particular ruthlessness toward the women who lived inside it, offering them enormous material comfort in exchange for a complete absence of public dignity. It is worth sitting, too, with how thoroughly this arrangement depended on silence to function at all. A kept woman's security relied on discretion nearly as much as it relied on the underlying gift itself. A scandal too public, too loud, too impossible to ignore, could still unravel even a well-secured arrangement, dragging a woman's private comfort into a courtroom or a newspaper column where public opinion, rather than private law, would ultimately decide her fate. You will see, before tonight is through, exactly what happens when that discretion fails, when a story that should have stayed quiet becomes instead the loudest scandal in the country. It is worth mentioning, too, a 4th kind of woman this story will not spend much time on tonight, though she deserves at least a passing acknowledgement. Not every woman in this precarious position was young or beautiful or newly arrived in a wealthy man's household. Some were older companions, long-time housekeepers, distant relatives who had quietly managed a bachelor's or widower's household for decades, gradually becoming as indispensable to his daily comfort as any romantic attachment might have been. These women, too, sometimes found themselves the unexpected beneficiaries of a lifetime's accumulated gratitude, converted, in the same quiet arithmetic this story keeps returning to, into deeds and settlements that no family member expected and few are prepared to contest. There is a reason, too, that this particular arithmetic tends to surface most clearly in the biographies of the very wealthy, even though the underlying pattern surely repeated itself, on a smaller scale, in countless households far too modest to ever attract a newspaper's attention. Wealth leaves records. It generates probate filings, estate inventories, newspaper coverage, the raw material historians eventually sift through generations later to reconstruct what actually happened inside a household long since closed up and forgotten. A shopkeeper's quiet arrangement with a long-time companion left no such trail. It simply happened privately and disappeared along with the 2 people who lived it, unrecorded and unrecoverable. The three women you will meet tonight are visible to us precisely because their circumstances intersected with fortunes large enough to leave a paper trail. It is worth remembering that visibility itself was never evenly distributed, any more than security was. It is worth naming, too, before this chapter closes, the particular emotional discipline all three of these women would have needed simply to survive their circumstances, whatever the eventual financial outcome. Each of them lived for years, sometimes decades, inside relationships that offered genuine comfort alongside genuine precarity, never fully certain which quality would define their future more. That is an exhausting way to live, regardless of how the story eventually resolves, and it is worth holding a measure of simple compassion for all three women as we prepare to meet them properly, whatever judgment their choices might otherwise invite from a comfortable distance of more than a century. There is a final framing worth offering before the stories themselves begin. Think of tonight less as three separate biographies, and more as three attempts at solving the same quiet problem, each attempted independently, under different circumstances, with different tools and different outcomes. The problem was simply this: how does a woman with no formal claim on a fortune build genuine, lasting security inside a century determined to deny her one? Watch, across the hours ahead, how differently three intelligent, resourceful women answered that same question. Let the evening settle around you now. Somewhere a clock strikes a small, unhurried hour, and the story is ready to begin properly, in a room where the arithmetic of gifts and wills first starts to matter. Picture a ledger, if you can hold something so dry in your mind at this hour. Not because the numbers matter for their own sake, but because the shape of the ledger explains everything that follows tonight, and once you have seen the shape, you will not need to think about numbers again. On one side of the ledger sits a wife. Her claim to her husband's fortune exists mostly in the future tense. It is a claim on what will happen after he dies, filtered through a will he wrote, administered by executors he chose, honoured only after every creditor with an older and sharper claim has already been paid in full. A wife's fortune in this century is a promise. Promises, as three wives in an earlier telling of this history discovered, can be broken by men who are no longer alive to explain themselves. On the other side of the ledger sits a different kind of claim entirely, though society at the time had no polite name for the woman who held it. Her claim exists in the present tense. A house deeded to her, this year, this month, this week, is hers the instant the deed is signed and recorded. A necklace placed around her throat does not need to wait for anyone's death to belong to her. Cash given into her own account, opened in her own name, becomes untouchable the moment it clears. This is the quiet, almost invisible mechanism that made a handful of Gilded Age mistresses more financially secure in the long run than the wives who legally outranked them. Not because society favoured them, society despised them, publicly and often cruelly, but because the law that punished them socially left one narrow door wide open financially, and a few of them found it and walked through, whether by calculation or simple good fortune. Consider what a will actually was, in practical terms, for a woman standing outside a marriage. Nothing. A dying man's mistress had no standing to inherit unless he named her explicitly, and naming her explicitly in a formal will was itself a kind of public confession that most men, even at the edge of death, could not quite bring themselves to make. It humiliated the family. It invited lawsuits. It handed the newspapers a headline that would follow his name into the ground. But a gift required no such confession. A gift could be made quietly, incrementally, disguised as an allowance, a birthday, a Christmas, a simple kindness between friends. Nobody needed to explain a house purchased 2 years ago. Nobody needed to justify jewellery given on an ordinary Tuesday. By the time anyone thought to add it all up, it had already dissolved into the ordinary furniture of a woman's life, indistinguishable from anything she might have purchased with money that was unambiguously permanently her own, her. There is a phrase lawyers of the era used, when they used one at all, for property transferred this way: an executed gift. Once executed, once handed over, signed over, moved from his control into hers, it could not be unexecuted. A creditor arriving after a man's death to settle his debts could seize the mansion still in his own name, the art still hanging on his own walls, the stock still registered to him. He could not reach into a woman's jewellery case in a house that had never belonged to him and take back what he no longer owned. you begin to see perhaps why a woman positioned outside the formal architecture of marriage might, against every social expectation of the century, end up standing on steadier financial ground than the woman positioned inside it. The wife's fortune was a locked door with a promise taped to it. The mistress's fortune, however small it began, was whatever had already been carried through the door and set down inside her own house before the lock ever mattered. None of this made these women's lives easy. Understand that clearly before we go further, because the story tonight is not a fairy tale, and it would be dishonest to tell it as one. Every woman in this account paid for her financial position with something the century considered more valuable than money. Her reputation, her place at other women's tables, her right to walk into a church or a theatre box without a room falling quiet around her. Society's punishment was real, and it was constant, and it did not soften with time the way a bruise softens. Doors closed, invitations stopped arriving. Children, when there were children, grew up carrying a status that could never be fully explained away no matter how much money eventually surrounded them. But money, in this particular century, in this particular set of circumstances, turned out to be a strange kind of patience. It did not care what the newspapers said about the woman who held it. It did not require an invitation to Mrs. Astor's ballroom in order to keep accumulating quietly in a bank vault. It simply sat and waited, and in 3 very different households across 3 very different decades, it slowly became the only thing left standing once everything louder and more respectable around it had collapsed. This is where the story properly begins, not with a scandal, though a scandal is coming softly, the way weather arrives from a great distance. It begins with a girl in Richmond, Virginia, whose father is already gone, whose mother is already taking in boarders to keep a roof overhead, and who has no way of knowing on the ordinary evening we're about to enter that she will one day be called the richest woman in America. There is a useful comparison waiting nearby if you think back to the wives you have already met in this history. Anna Gould signed checks and approved budgets for a household she believed she understood, only to discover, years later, that the man managing those budgets had already spent his way through most of her inheritance before she ever thought to ask a hard question. Her claim was, technically, the stronger one under the law. It did her almost no practical good, because the law's protection arrived, if it arrived at all, only after the damage was already done. Contrast that with a woman receiving smaller, steadier gifts across the same span of years. A townhouse this year, a piece of jewellery the next, cash settled quietly into an account bearing only her own name. She has no grand legal claim to anything. She also has nothing left to lose, because whatever she has already been given cannot later be ungiven by a court, a creditor, or a dying man's change of heart. It is worth sitting, too, with how differently these 2 kinds of women were treated by the newspapers of the era, because the press's moral judgment and the underlying financial reality rarely lined up. A ruined wife was treated with a kind of tragic sympathy. A woman more sinned against than sinning, a victim of a husband's concealment. A mistress, however secure her actual finances, was treated with contempt regardless of circumstance. Her stability, when the papers noticed it at all, described as evidence of moral failure rather than practical foresight. This mismatch between moral judgment and financial reality is, in its own way, the quiet engine driving every story you will hear tonight. Society punished the women who were, in strictly financial terms, the more secure of the 2 categories, and offered its sympathy to the women whose claims, however legally superior on paper, so often dissolved into nothing the moment a husband's hidden debts came due. None of this made the mistress's life comfortable. It is worth repeating that point as many times as it takes to land, because it would be far too easy, at this sleepy hour, to let the arithmetic sound like a clever trick rather than the exhausting, precarious, socially costly existence it actually was for the women living inside it. Every gift came bundled with dependence. Every house came without the security of a name that could not be taken away by a change in a man's mood. But arithmetic, unlike affection, does not change its mind. A deed recorded in a woman's name remains recorded in her name whether the man who gave it to her still loves her, still remembers her, or has been dead for 30 years. This is the quiet, unglamorous power at the centre of tonight's story, and it is worth holding on to as we now leave the ledger behind and step into the first of 3 very different lives built, in their own separate ways, on top of it. It helps, at this point, to understand how slowly the legal reforms of this century actually moved, because the pace explains why this particular loophole remained open for as long as it did. New York's Married Women's Property Act of 1848 was among the earliest meaningful cracks in the wall of coverture, allowing a wife for the first time to hold property she had brought into a marriage without it automatically becoming her husband's. Mississippi had passed a narrower version even earlier, in 1839, and other states followed through the 1850s and 60s, each reform arriving a little later, a little more cautiously than the reformers pushing for it would have liked. But a statute allowing a wife to hold property was not the same as a statute requiring a husband to disclose what that property actually consisted of, or how it was being managed, or whether it still existed at all. Trusts remained, for decades after these early reforms, managed almost exclusively by men, fathers, brothers, husbands, business partners, who answered to no one but their own judgment, and occasionally a court that only intervened once a dispute had already become public and ugly. A wife's improved legal standing on paper did very little in practice to improve her actual access to information about her own supposed wealth. This gap between formal legal reform and lived financial reality is, in its own way, the quiet backdrop against which every story tonight unfolds. The law was, slowly, haltingly, becoming friendlier to women across these decades. But the pace of that change lagged so far behind the pace at which fortunes were actually made, spent, hidden, and lost, that an entire generation of wives lived and died without ever benefiting from reforms that, on paper, were supposedly protecting them the whole time. There is a final piece of this arithmetic worth understanding before we leave it behind, one concerning probate itself, the formal legal process by which a dead man's estate was catalogued, valued, and distributed. Probate was, by design, a slow and public process, unfolding over months or even years, with every creditor granted an opportunity to step forward and stake a claim against the estate before any heir received a single dollar. A wife's inheritance, however large it appeared on paper, waited patiently in a queue behind every debt the dead man had ever incurred, visible or hidden. A gift already given, by contrast, had never been part of any queue at all. It had simply already happened, complete and finished, long before any creditor thought to come looking. It is worth adding, too, that trustees themselves operated under remarkably little oversight throughout most of this century, a fact that mattered enormously for any wife whose inheritance was structured as a trust rather than an outright gift. A trustee could invest conservatively or recklessly, could pay himself considerable fees for his management, could delay distributions for reasons a beneficiary had no practical way to challenge, all while remaining, technically, within the bounds of his legal duty. The women who escaped this particular vulnerability were not the ones with the largest trusts. They were the ones who had somehow avoided being placed inside a trust's slow, opaque machinery in the first place. Let your shoulders settle a little further into whatever is holding you tonight. The ledger is closed for now. What comes next is simply a life, unfolding the way lives do, one unremarkable room at a time. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before we step properly into Arabella's story, it is worth taking a moment to picture the wider American world she was born into, because none of what follows makes full sense without at least a rough sketch of that backdrop. America in the early 1850s was still, in most practical respects, an agricultural country, stitched together by rivers and turnpikes more than by rail, its great fortunes concentrated mostly in shipping, in cotton, in the older mercantile families of the eastern seaboard who had held their positions for generations. The railroad fortunes that would eventually define the Gilded Age, the fortunes of a Huntington, a Gould, a Vanderbilt, were still, in these years, only beginning to take their first tentative shape. Nobody yet knew that the coming decades would produce wealth on a scale the country had never previously imagined. It was also, unmistakably, a country moving toward catastrophe. The sectional tensions that would erupt into civil war by the decade's end were already visible to anyone paying attention, and a child born in Richmond, Virginia, in this particular decade was born into the eventual heart of that catastrophe, in a city that would, within her own childhood, become the capital of a rebellion, and would burn in part as that rebellion finally collapsed. It is worth remembering, too, the particular fragility of a woman's economic position in this pre-war world, a fragility this story has already spent considerable time examining, but which bears repeating here at the level of ordinary daily life. A woman without a husband, without an inheritance, without a trade she could practically pursue, had remarkably few paths available to her, beyond the charity of relatives or the uncertain hospitality of strangers paying for room and board. This was simply the ordinary texture of the world, unremarkable to the people living inside it, though it looks from this distance like a set of constraints almost impossible to imagine navigating successfully. And yet women did navigate it, constantly, using whatever small tools the world left available to them. Careful management, quiet resourcefulness, the patient cultivation of useful relationships, the willingness to take considerable personal risk when a genuine opportunity finally presented itself. Arabella's later life, however extraordinary its eventual outcome, was built on exactly these same ordinary tools, deployed with unusual persistence across an unusually long span of years. Let this brief sketch of the wider world settle now before we step back into the narrower, more intimate frame of one particular Richmond household. The century was vast and violent and largely indifferent to any single life unfolding within it. What follows is the story of one girl who found her way through that vastness anyway, one small, careful decision at a time. The house is narrow, the way houses built close together on a Richmond street tend to be narrow, with a hallway that always smells faintly of whatever has been cooked recently for whichever stranger is paying to sleep upstairs this month. It is the 1850s. The girl who will one day be called Arabella has not yet acquired the name that history will remember, and the fortune that name will eventually carry is not even a rumour yet, not even a possibility anyone in this hallway could imagine. Her father dies when she's still a child, young enough that the loss settles into her less as grief and more as a permanent quiet recalibration of what the family can afford. Her mother does what a great many widowed mothers in this century did when a husband's income vanished and no safety net existed to catch the family beneath him. She opens the house to boarders. Strangers pay for a bed and a share of the table, and the daughters of the house learn early, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that respectability and solvency are two entirely separate conditions, and that a family can maintain the appearance of one while quietly losing its grip on the other. You can imagine, if you like, the particular texture of that kind of childhood. The good dress kept for Sundays and church visits, mended so many times the mending becomes its own kind of fabric. The careful arithmetic of a household where every boarder's rent is counted twice before it is spent once. The polite fiction, maintained for neighbours and relatives, that everything is perfectly fine, while everyone inside the house understands, without discussion, that everything is not. It is difficult to overstate how differently the Gilded Age treated poverty depending on where it found you. A poor family with an old name might still be received in certain parlours, invited to certain teas, forgiven its threadbare curtains because the bloodline underneath them was considered sound. A poor family with no name at all had no such cushion. It simply fell and kept falling, unless one of its members found some unlikely rope to catch hold of on the way down. In the middle of the 1860s, still a teenager, the girl travels north to New York in the company of a man named John Archer Worsham, considerably older than she is. The precise nature of their arrangement has never been fully settled by history, and it likely never will be. Some accounts describe a marriage. Others, examining the records more closely, find no evidence such a marriage ever legally existed, and conclude instead that she was, in the plainest and least comfortable term available to the century, his mistress. Whichever it was, it did not last. Worsham dies not long afterward, leaving her with a young son, a boy who will grow up carrying the Huntington name, though very few people at the time understood exactly how he came to have it. She's left in her 20s, a woman with a child, no husband and no fortune of her own, in a city that offered exactly two respectable paths forward for a woman in her position, marriage or the slow social erasure that came from having none. She chooses instead something the century had no proper name for. She becomes useful. In the late 1870s, she purchases a small piece of New York property, an unremarkable transaction on its own, except that it demonstrates something worth noticing early in this story. Even in these lean years, she is not simply drifting through misfortune. She is paying attention to real estate, to ownership, to the quiet difference between renting a life and owning a piece of one. That same property will later be sold for a considerable sum to a man named John D. Rockefeller, though that sale belongs to a later chapter of her life, long after the events of tonight. It is around this same period that she enters the household of a wealthy railroad man named Collis Huntington, one of the most formidable and least sentimental financiers of his generation, a man who had built and broken fortunes across half a continent of track. His wife, Elizabeth, is not well. The particular nature of her illness varies by account. Some describe a long decline, others a more sudden collapse of health, but the fact of it is consistent across every telling. Elizabeth Huntington is dying slowly in a house that money cannot make comfortable enough to compensate for what it is losing. And into that house, in whatever capacity the century allowed itself to record, companion, caretaker, family friend, comes the young woman from the Richmond boarding house, now grown into someone considerably more composed than the girl who left it. She is not yet Mrs. Huntington. She's not yet anyone the newspapers have bothered to notice. She's simply a woman near a dying woman's bedside, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of sitting with someone whose husband is often away on business, whose days have narrowed down to the width of a sick room. There is no record of exactly what passed between them in that room, no diary entry, no letter that survives to tell you whether Elizabeth Huntington ever understood what her presence there might one day become, or whether she was simply grateful, in the plain human way of the very ill, for someone patient enough to sit beside her. It is worth pausing for a moment on the sheer improbability of the path that had brought her to this particular room. A girl born in a narrow Richmond house, with no fortune and no name that carried any weight beyond her own street, sitting now at the bedside of one of the wealthiest women in the country. Nothing about her childhood would have suggested this outcome as even remotely likely, and yet here she is, not because of any single dramatic turn of fortune, but because of a long, unglamorous accumulation of small decisions, leaving Richmond, surviving Worsham's death, buying a small piece of property when she had almost nothing else, and finally, simply, being present and useful in a household that badly needed both. Consider, too, how differently this same story might have unfolded had she arrived in this household a decade earlier, or a decade later, when Collis Huntington's fortune was either far smaller, or later far more heavily scrutinised by a press that had grown considerably more aggressive about tracking the private lives of the very wealthy. Timing, in this story, as in so many others across this history, mattered nearly as much as any individual quality of character. She arrived in exactly the right room, at exactly the right moment in a fortune's arc, though nobody involved could have known it at the time. What is certain is only this. A young woman with almost nothing behind her, no fortune, an uncertain past, a small son with no clear claim to any name worth having, has found her way, through nothing more dramatic than patience and proximity, into the innermost room of one of the wealthiest households in America. The rest of what happens will unfold slowly, the way most consequential things in a life actually unfold, without fanfare, one unremarkable Tuesday leading quietly into the next. But something has already shifted in this narrow window of years, something too small to notice from the outside and too large in hindsight to call anything but the beginning. Consider, too, what it would have meant for a girl in this position to watch her own mother manage an entire household's finances largely alone, out of necessity rather than choice. Widowhood in this century, for a woman without independent means, was less a period of mourning than a sudden, unforgiving crash course in commerce, negotiating rents, managing accounts, deciding which small comforts could still be afforded and which had to be quietly abandoned. A daughter watching this unfold at close range absorbs, whether she intends to or not, an entirely different relationship to money than a daughter raised inside an unbroken, comfortable household ever develops. Comfort teaches a person to trust that money will simply continue arriving. Precarity teaches a person to watch it closely at every stage of its arrival and departure. It is worth noting as well that this particular kind of early hardship was rarely discussed openly, even within families that had experienced it. The century placed enormous social value on the appearance of unbroken respectability, and a family that had once needed to take in boarders to survive would have gone to considerable lengths, in later, more comfortable years, to avoid mentioning it at all. This is part of why so much of Arabella's earliest history remains genuinely uncertain to historians even today, not because the events themselves were unusual, but because the century's own instinct for discretion buried them, deliberately, under decades of careful silence. It is worth remembering, too, that the Civil War itself would have touched this household directly, in ways the historical record does not specify, but common sense makes almost certain. A Richmond family in the 1860s lived at the very centre of the Confederacy, in a city that would eventually burn as the war reached its final collapse. Whatever precise hardships this particular family endured during those years, and Richmond's civilian population endured a great many, from shortages to shelling to the eventual chaos of evacuation and fire in 1865, they would have layered on top of the family's existing financial precarity, compounding an already difficult situation with the added indiscriminate violence of a nation tearing itself apart. A girl who survived her childhood in exactly this city, during exactly these years, would have carried forward a particular resilience that later, calmer decades could never fully erase. She had already watched an entire social and economic order collapse once, suddenly and completely, by the time she was still a teenager. The slower, quieter uncertainties of boarding house life, and an ambiguous arrangement with an older man in New York would hardly have seemed, by comparison, like the most frightening thing she had ever navigated. There is a final image worth holding on to from these Richmond years, before this chapter releases you into the decades that follow. A young girl, standing at a train platform, a single trunk beside her, watching a city she has never left before recede slowly out of view. She does not know, on this particular morning, that she's watching the last of her old life disappear. She knows only that she's going somewhere else, with a man she barely understands, toward a future that offers no guarantees beyond the ordinary hope that anything might be better than staying. It is worth remembering, too, that trains themselves were still a relatively recent marvel in this particular decade, the railroad network connecting American cities having expanded dramatically only in the years just before this journey. A teenage girl boarding a northbound train in the 1860s was participating, without any particular awareness of it, in one of the great transformations of her century, the same expanding rail network that would eventually make Collis Huntington's fortune, the very fortune she would one day inherit. There is a quiet symmetry in that detail worth noting at this late hour, the tracks beneath her carrying her both toward her future and, unknowingly, toward the industry that would eventually define it. It is worth remembering one final time that this Richmond chapter of the story ends not with certainty, but with departure. A girl leaving, a future entirely unwritten, no guarantee that anything waiting for her in New York would prove better than what she left behind. Every woman in tonight's story begins this way, at some point, standing at the edge of an uncertain departure, with nothing but a small trunk and whatever resilience her earlier hardships had already taught her. It is worth carrying that image forward, gently, into the chapters that follow, as a reminder of how ordinary and unremarkable each of these extraordinary stories once looked from its very beginning. Let the room in your mind grow quiet now, the sick bed dim, the hour late. There is more to see, but not yet tonight, not yet in this chapter. For now, simply rest in the knowledge that a life is turning slowly, the way a key turns in a lock that has not yet realized it is about to open. Before we step into the sick room itself, it is worth understanding a little more about the man at the centre of the household Arabella had just entered, because Collis Huntington's own story shaped everything that would eventually follow. He was one of what history would later call the Big Four, the group of Sacramento merchants who financed and built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, a project so audacious in its engineering ambition that many contemporary observers doubted it could be completed at all. Blasting tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, laying track across deserts with no reliable water source, coordinating a labour force of thousands of workers, many of them Chinese immigrants whose contributions the era's histories would spend the following century largely erasing. This was the scale of enterprise Collis Huntington had already mastered by the time he entered the sick room this chapter has just described. He was not, by most accounts, an easy man to work for or against. He negotiated federal land grants and subsidies with the same relentless, unsentimental focus he brought to every other aspect of his business, and he accumulated enemies throughout his career in roughly the same proportion he accumulated wealth. It is worth remembering this reputation as we watch him, in the following chapter, navigate the considerably more private and considerably more delicate territory of grief, remarriage, and a young woman's quiet, patient presence in his household. The railroad itself, completed in 1869 with the famous Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit, transformed the country in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from this distance. It compressed a journey that had once taken months of dangerous overland travel into a matter of days. It opened the American West to settlement, commerce, and exploitation on a scale the previous generation could scarcely have imagined, and it made men like Collis Huntington extraordinarily wealthy, wealth that would eventually, through the quiet arithmetic this story keeps returning to, find its way into the hands of a woman who had once counted a stranger's rent twice before spending it once. There is a particular kind of household that only wealth in its later, quieter stage produces. A house large enough to contain entire lives that never cross paths, corridors long enough that a family can go days without hearing each other's footsteps. Collis Huntington's New York home, in the years we are visiting now, is exactly this kind of house. Somewhere in it, his wife Elizabeth spends most of her remaining hours in a single room, and somewhere else in it, business continues, servants continue, the ordinary machinery of wealth continues, largely indifferent to the slow event unfolding behind one closed door. You already know something about Collis Huntington if you paid attention to an earlier hour of this history, or if you simply know the shape of Gilded Age railroading. He was one of the men who built the Central Pacific, one of the so-called Big Four who joined the eastern and western halves of a continent with iron rail and considerable ruthlessness. He was not, by most accounts, a soft or sentimental man. He negotiated the way he built railroads, for advantage, and without much patience for anyone who could not offer him something useful in return. And yet in his own household, in the years his first wife is failing, something in his habits shifts in a way none of his railroad rivals would have predicted from watching him in a boardroom. He begins spending time with the young woman who sits with Elizabeth. Not scandalously, not at first, not in any way the newspapers of the day found worth reporting, simply present. A man visiting the sick room of his wife, and finding, perhaps to his own quiet surprise, that the company waiting there had become a kind of company he sought out. It would be easy, from this distance, to tell this part of the story as something simpler and crueler than it likely was. A calculating young woman positioning herself beside a dying wife, waiting with open patience for a door to close so another might open. The truth, as it usually is in lives lived a century and a half ago and recorded only in fragments, resists that simplicity. What the record actually shows is something more human and considerably less tidy. A woman who had already lost her own footing once, who had already raised a son largely on her own resourcefulness, doing the ordinary work of sitting with someone who was suffering. Whether affection grew between her and Collis Huntington slowly, across the months of Elizabeth's decline, or whether it arrived only after Elizabeth's death, in 1883 by most accounts, is a distinction the historical record does not settle cleanly and perhaps never can. What is certain is the order of events, and in a story built on arithmetic the order matters more than the sentiment behind it. Elizabeth Huntington dies, and in the following year, Collis Huntington travels to San Francisco and marries the woman who had spent that final stretch of his first wife's life sitting quietly in the room down the hall. Consider for a moment how differently the century would have judged a man who had simply announced the week after his wife's funeral that he intended to marry his mistress of many years. That was not, by most accounts, quite the shape of what happened here. The public record, thin as it is, suggests a courtship that unfolded within the bounds society could tolerate, even if certain drawing rooms whispered about the timing for years afterward, the way drawing rooms always whispered about anything that moved faster than convention preferred. There was also, waiting quietly in the wings of this marriage, a young boy. Archer, born more than a decade earlier under circumstances the century never fully clarified, is by now a teenager, old enough to understand that his own position in the world is about to change dramatically, and young enough to have no real say in how. When Collis Huntington marries the boy's mother, he also, formally and legally, adopts the boy as his own son. It is worth pausing on the word adopts because it does more work in this story than it might first appear to. An adoption, unlike an informal arrangement of affection and support, is a legal act. It creates rights that cannot be quietly withdrawn later by an angry relative or a hostile executor. Whatever uncertainty had shadowed the boy's early years, and there was considerable uncertainty, including persistent rumours, never fully confirmed, that Collis himself might have been his biological father all along, That uncertainty is now, in the eyes of the law, entirely resolved. The boy is a Huntington, nothing left to argue about. It is a small pattern that will repeat itself in different forms throughout tonight's story. Formal, legal acts, a marriage, an adoption, a signed deed, carry a permanence that informal affection, however genuine, does not. Every woman in this history who ends up financially secure ends up that way not because a man loved her, though several of them plainly did, but because that love was, at some point, converted into paper, into something a court could not later pretend had never existed. For now, in this quieter middle chapter of Arabella's story, no fortune has yet changed hands in any dramatic way. She's simply a wife now, married into one of the great fortunes of the American West, mistress, in the older, more respectable sense of the word, of a household that had once employed her only as company for a dying woman. The Sentry will spend the rest of her life trying to decide how it feels about that. Some rooms will never quite forgive the timing, others will simply stop asking questions the moment enough years and enough money have passed. Both responses are waiting for her, further down this story in roughly equal measure. It is worth returning briefly to the sick room itself before we leave this chapter, because a single sentence about a dying woman passes by too quickly at this hour, and the room deserves a little more of your attention. Illness in the 1880s was rarely tidy. There were no machines quietly measuring a pulse through the night, no bright hallway lights to soften the dark. There was a lamp turned low, a basin of water changed on some regular schedule, the particular hush that settles over a house where everyone has learned to move carefully past a certain door. Elizabeth Huntington's final months would have unfolded inside exactly that hush, day folding into day with very little to distinguish one from the next except the slow, unmistakable direction of things. Whoever sat with her during those months, and the record suggests Arabella did so with real consistency, would have spent long stretches of time doing very little of anything dramatic at all. Reading aloud, perhaps, adjusting a blanket, listening to a laboured breath settle for a while into something steadier. This is not the stuff of scandal. It is the stuff of ordinary, exhausting care, the kind that rarely gets written down because nobody involved thought, at the time, that it would matter to anyone beyond the two people in the room. And yet it did matter, though not in any way either woman could have anticipated. Whatever quiet trust or gratitude grew inside that sick room became, whether by intention or simple accumulation, the foundation for everything that followed. A man does not, as a rule, marry the person who sat faithfully beside his dying wife unless something real passed between them during those long hours. Respect, at minimum, and very often something considerably warmer. Richmond itself, in these years, was a city living through its own considerable upheaval, the old certainties of the antebellum South giving way, slowly and unevenly, to a Reconstruction-era economy that offered no one, regardless of former standing, any guarantee of continued comfort. A boarding house in this particular city, in this particular decade, would have hosted a shifting cast of travellers navigating their own uncertain fortunes, merchants rebuilding trade routes, clerks seeking new positions, the ordinary churn of a regional economy trying to reassemble itself after considerable disruption. The girl growing up inside that churn would have absorbed, without anyone needing to explain it directly, a very particular lesson about how quickly an entire social order could rearrange itself, and how little warning it tended to give beforehand. There is a kind of practical education available inside a household like that, one no formal schooling of the era would have offered a girl in her position. She would have learned to read a stranger's character quickly, out of simple necessity, since her family's livelihood depended on choosing boarders who paid reliably and behaved respectably. She would have learned the particular skill of appearing entirely unbothered by financial strain in front of company, while managing, behind closed doors, a household budget stretched thin enough to show every seam. These are not skills history typically credits as preparation for anything significant, and yet, traced forward across the following decades, they look very much like the exact skills a woman would need to navigate the far larger, far wealthier households she would eventually find herself inside. There is also, worth mentioning gently before this chapter closes, the boy waiting quietly at the edges of all of this. Archer had spent his entire childhood without a settled name, without a father whose relationship to him the world was willing to state plainly, shuttled between whatever arrangements his mother could manage on her own. Whatever else this marriage would come to mean for Arabella, it meant something enormous and immediate for her son as well. The sudden, total transformation of a boy with no clear place in the world into the adopted heir of one of the great fortunes of the American West. Children rarely get much say in the marriages that reshape their lives this dramatically. Archer, in this instance, appears to have been fortunate in where the reshaping ultimately led him. There is one more thread worth gathering up before this chapter closes, concerning Collis Huntington's own state of mind in the immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death. He was, by 1883, a man in his early 60s who had spent nearly 4 decades building an empire, watching partners die, watching rivals collapse, watching the country itself transform around him from a loose collection of coastal cities into a single continent bound together by rail. Grief, for a man like this, rarely announced itself loudly. It would have settled instead into the ordinary rhythms of his continuing business, a quieter weight carried alongside the negotiations and the ledgers, noticed perhaps only by the people closest to him, including, one imagines, the woman who had spent Elizabeth's final months at her bedside, and who now found herself in the strange arithmetic of grief and proximity, closer to him than almost anyone else remaining in his life. It is worth remembering, too, that Elizabeth Huntington herself was not a woman without her own considerable history, though this account has necessarily kept its attention on the 2 people whose lives would eventually reshape a fortune. She had been Collis's wife since long before his railroad ventures made him one of the wealthiest men in the country, had shared in the earlier, harder years of his career when the outcome of his ambitions remained genuinely uncertain. Her death closed out a marriage that had spanned decades of real partnership, whatever its final chapter's quiet complications, and it is worth honouring that longer history even as this particular story moves its attention toward what came after. It is worth pausing, too, on how differently this courtship would have looked from the perspective of Collis Huntington's business associates and rivals, men who had spent decades watching him negotiate railroad deals with icy, unsentimental precision. Whatever they privately thought of his choice to marry the woman who had cared for his dying wife, few of them would have dared voice it directly to a man who had broken stronger opponents than any of them over the course of his career. Business relationships in this era rarely survived open criticism of a partner's private life, and Collis Huntington's continued dominance of his industry ensured that whatever whispers circulated, they circulated well out of his hearing. It is worth remembering, too, that this entire chapter has unfolded largely in the register of inference rather than certainty, because so little direct documentation survives from these particular years. What can be said with confidence is only the outer shape of events, a sick room, a death, a marriage the following year. What passed between 2 specific people in the private hours of those months remains, appropriately perhaps, their own, protected by exactly the same discretion that would later protect Arabella's financial security. Some rooms, this story has already suggested, keep their secrets regardless of how much time eventually passes. For tonight, let her rest in the plain, undramatic fact of the marriage itself, or whatever arrangement passed for one in those final years of waiting. A sick room in New York, a courtship the historical record will never fully clarify, and a small ceremony waiting just ahead in San Francisco, joining threads that had been slowly, patiently drawing toward each other for the better part of 2 decades. You are somewhere on the edge of the continent now, in a city built almost entirely on the sudden, restless money of the previous 3 decades. Gold first, and then the railroads that carried the gold, and the men who built the railroads, one of whom is standing in a room today, a little older than he once was, marrying a woman the Eastern newspapers have not yet learned to gossip about, though they will learn soon enough. There is no grand public ceremony to describe here, no ballroom of 400 witnesses, no account of the dress or the flowers that survives in enough detail to linger over. Part of this is simply the nature of the historical record, thin in exactly the places you most wish it were thick. But part of it, almost certainly, is deliberate. A quiet wedding draws fewer questions than a large one, and questions were the one thing this particular union could least afford, especially so soon after a first wife's death. What we do know is durable enough to matter. The marriage is legal, recorded, uncontested by anyone with the standing to contest it. Whatever whispers followed the couple back east, and there were whispers, persistent ones, about a companion who had perhaps become something more before propriety strictly allowed. None of them carried enough legal weight to threaten what had just been formalized in this room. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is easy, at this distance, to imagine the century's judgment as a single unified force, crushing anyone who stepped outside its lines. It was not. Society's judgment and the law's judgment were two entirely separate mechanisms, running on separate tracks, and a woman could lose badly at one while winning completely at the other. Arabella would spend the coming years losing, repeatedly, and often painfully, at the first. She had already, on this ordinary San Francisco afternoon, won the second. Consider what she has actually acquired, in the plainest financial terms, simply by virtue of this signature. She's now the legal wife of one of the wealthiest men in the country, entitled under the law of marriage to a widow's claim on his estate should he predecease her, entitled to his name, entitled, crucially, and this is the part the drawing rooms back east could never quite undo no matter how loudly they gossiped, to every gift and provision he chooses to make for her during the remainder of his life. Collis Huntington, it turns out, chooses to make a great many. He is by now in his early 60s, a man who has spent his entire adult life building things that were meant to last. Railroads, docks, an entire commercial infrastructure stretching from California to the Atlantic, and something in him seems to extend that same instinct toward permanence into his second marriage. He does not simply support his new wife. He begins, deliberately and repeatedly, to place resources directly into her hands in her name, in forms that no later dispute could easily unwind. None of this happens all at once, and none of it happens in a way that draws the kind of newspaper attention a single dramatic gift might have attracted. It accumulates instead the way most real fortunes accumulate, in 100 unremarkable transactions rather than one spectacular one. Property here, a settlement there, jewellery and art acquired steadily over years rather than showered all at once in some theatrical gesture. By the time anyone outside the marriage thinks to add it up, it will already be too large and too diffuse to easily challenge. You might wonder, reasonably, whether the drawing rooms of New York ever softened toward her, whether enough years and enough obvious respectability ever purchased her a genuine welcome among the old families who had shut their doors at the first hint of scandal. The honest answer is, only partially and only slowly and never completely on their terms rather than hers. She would spend much of the coming decade building an identity that did not depend on their approval, as a collector, a philanthropist, eventually as one of the most significant patrons of art and education this history will introduce you to. She built, in other words, a second kind of respectability, one that did not require anyone's permission to grant it. There is a particular kind of resilience in that choice worth noticing even at this sleepy hour. A woman shut out of one form of belonging does not always spend the rest of her life waiting at the closed door. Sometimes she builds an entirely different house with its own doors, and eventually the people who once excluded her find themselves, a little sheepishly, asking to be let in. For now, in 1884, none of that future is visible yet. There is only a marriage, quietly performed, legally sound, and a young son formally adopted into a name that will carry him, and eventually his own children, into institutions and libraries and philanthropic legacies that stretch well into the following century. 16 years remain before this particular marriage ends. 16 years of steady, patient accumulation, not merely of money, though there will be a great deal of that, but of the small legal and financial acts that will, when the moment finally comes, matter far more than any amount of social forgiveness ever could. Consider, too, the practical shape of a marriage between a man in his 60s and a woman roughly 20 years his junior, both of them already carrying the weight of earlier lives that the century preferred not to discuss. There would have been no illusions between them about youth or first love or the kind of romance the popular novels of the era like to sell. What there was instead was something arguably more durable. Two people who had each already survived considerable hardship, choosing a partnership built on practical trust rather than untested infatuation. Collis Huntington had, by this point in his life, negotiated with governors, senators, and rival railroad barons who would have gladly ruined him given the smallest opening. He was not a man given to sentimental gestures he did not intend to honour. When he began placing property and provisions into Arabella's name, It is worth understanding this not as romantic impulse, but as the same deliberate, methodical habit of mind he brought to every transaction of his professional life, a habit that this time happened to work decisively in a woman's favour, rather than against some rivals' interests. The house they eventually established themselves in, first in New York and later expanding across multiple properties, became over these years a genuine centre of art collecting, a habit both of them shared and which would come to define the second half of Arabella's life far more than the scandal of its beginning ever did. Paintings acquired in these years, quietly, without much newspaper notice, would form the earliest foundation of a collection that eventually grew into one of the most significant private galleries in the country. It is easy, from the distance of more than a century, to flatten this period of Arabella's life into a simple story of a woman waiting patiently for wealth to accumulate around her. The truth, as it usually is, contains more texture than that. She was, by several accounts, an active and increasingly confident participant in these acquisitions, developing over the years a genuine eye for quality that the dealers and auction houses of the era came to respect, regardless of what the drawing rooms of old New York still whispered about her past. There is something worth noticing in that detail at this quiet hour. A woman excluded from one kind of authority, the social authority of the closed drawing room, can sometimes build an entirely different kind of authority instead, one measured not in invitations received but in expertise earned, in judgment trusted, in a reputation that has nothing to do with where a person came from and everything to do with what she has learned to recognize. San Francisco itself, in 1884, was barely more than 3 decades removed from its own founding as a gold rush boomtown, and something of that improvisational, self-invented character still clung to the city even as it matured into a genuine metropolis. This was a place, more than almost any other in the country, where a person's past mattered considerably less than their present usefulness or their present wealth. Fortunes here had been made overnight by prospectors who could not have told you their own grandfather's name, and lost just as quickly by men who had arrived with nothing but confidence. A quiet wedding between a railroad baron and a woman whose earlier history invited whispered questions would have drawn far less scrutiny here than it might have in the older, more rigidly established society of the eastern seaboard. There is something fitting in that geography, worth noticing at this late hour. The fortune Arabella was marrying into had itself been built largely on the same restless, self-made energy that defined this city. Collis Huntington and his partners had financed and built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad through sheer force of will and financial daring, connecting a coastline that had, only 15 years earlier, felt impossibly distant from the rest of the country. A city built on reinvention was perhaps exactly the right place for two people who had each, in their own way, already reinvented themselves once before. It is worth remembering, too, that the Transcontinental Railroad itself, completed only 15 years before this marriage, had fundamentally reshaped what a fortune could even mean in America. Before its completion, wealth travelled slowly, in careful increments, limited by the physical difficulty of moving goods and people across an entire continent. After it, capital could move at the speed of a telegraph wire, and fortunes could be made or lost in a season rather than a generation. Collis Huntington had helped build the very infrastructure that made this new, faster kind of wealth possible, and it is worth noting that Arabella's own fortune, once it finally arrived, would move and accumulate at exactly this new, accelerated pace, rather than the slower rhythms that had governed her earlier life. There is a final detail worth carrying forward from this San Francisco chapter, one easy to overlook amid the larger sweep of fortune and scandal. Whatever else this marriage represented, it also represented simply two people choosing each other in a quiet room on an ordinary afternoon without the elaborate performance that so many of this century's grander unions demanded. No 400 guests, no dress recorded in loving detail by society columnists. Just a signature, a witness, and the plain fact of two lives joining together after each had already weathered considerably more hardship than most of their eventual peers on Fifth Avenue would ever have to face. It is worth remembering that quiet weddings of this kind were not, in themselves, unusual for this era. What made this one worth pausing over, decades later, was not the ceremony itself, but everything that grew from it. A fortune that would prove real rather than hollow, a philanthropy that would eventually earn a measure of grudging respect, and a library that still stands more than a century later, holding books that neither the bride nor the groom could have imagined collecting on the ordinary San Francisco afternoon when their marriage first began. There is a particular quality to how newlyweds in this position would have spent their earliest weeks together, worth imagining gently at this hour. Not a honeymoon in the modern romantic sense the following century would popularise, but something closer to a careful, deliberate settling in, visits to the properties Collis Huntington maintained across California, introductions to business partners who would need, eventually, to accept this new arrangement, whether they approved of it privately or not, and the slow, practical work of establishing a household that would need to function smoothly across the considerable distances his business still required him to travel. Marriage, for a man in Collis Huntington's position, was never simply a private matter. It was also inevitably a logistical one, folded into the larger architecture of an empire that never fully stopped operating even for a wedding. Arabella would have understood this rhythm already, in her own way, from her earlier years managing a household stretched thin by her mother's borders. The specific scale had changed almost beyond recognition, but the underlying skill, managing a complex domestic operation while the people around her attended to larger, more visible concerns, carried forward remarkably well from one life into the next. It is worth noticing once again how consistently her early hardships turned out to be quiet preparation for the very different life that eventually followed. It is worth remembering, too, the sheer physical scale of what Collis Huntington had already built by the time of this marriage. Thousands of miles of track stretching from the Pacific coast through the mountains and deserts of the American West, connecting cities that had once required months of dangerous overland travel to reach each other. Arabella married not simply a wealthy man, but a man who had, in a very literal sense, helped reshape the physical geography of an entire nation, compressing distances that had once seemed permanent and immovable into a matter of days. It is a fitting backdrop for a marriage that would itself compress an entire century's worth of assumptions about who deserved financial security into a single quiet signature on an ordinary San Francisco afternoon. There is one more detail worth carrying forward from this chapter, concerning the particular vulnerability and particular strength that met each other in this marriage. Collis Huntington, for all his wealth and power, was a man in his 60s who had just lost a wife of many decades, uncertain in his own private way about what remained ahead of him. Arabella, for all her earlier hardship, arrived at this marriage as a woman who had already survived considerably more instability than most brides of her era ever faced. Neither of them needed the other for simple survival. What they appear to have found instead was something more durable. Two people, each carrying their own history of loss and resilience, choosing to build whatever came next together rather than alone. Let this chapter close gently now, the way a door closes on a room where something quiet and permanent has just been settled. There is still a great deal of story ahead, a death to witness, a fortune to inherit, a second marriage even more improbable than the first, but all of it grows out of this one afternoon, this one signature, this one small ceremony on the far edge of the continent. Before we move forward 16 years to the moment Arabella's fortune is finally tested, it is worth pausing to understand the two great financial storms that swept through this entire era, because they form the backdrop against which every fortune in this history, including Arabella's, would eventually be measured. The panic of 1893 arrived like a sudden winter after a long, deceptive autumn of railroad overbuilding and speculative excess. Banks failed by the hundreds. Railroads, the favoured investment of an entire generation of wealthy Americans, collapsed into bankruptcy at a rate that shocked even seasoned financiers. Unemployment soared to levels the country would not see again until the Great Depression nearly 4 decades later. Fortunes that had seemed unshakable the previous spring simply evaporated over a matter of months, exposed as the leveraged, overextended structures they had always secretly been. The panic of 1907 arrived with similarly little warning, triggered this time by a failed attempt to corner the copper market, spreading with terrifying speed through the interconnected web of trust companies and banks that had grown, largely unregulated, across the intervening years. It took the personal intervention of J.P. Morgan himself, summoning the city's leading bankers to his private library and effectively refusing to let them leave until they agreed to shore up the failing institutions with their own capital, to prevent the entire American financial system from collapsing outright. Both panics tested every fortune this history has examined, and both revealed, with unforgiving clarity, which fortunes were built on genuine, durable value and which were built on borrowed confidence. The Gould railroads, already weakened by George's overambitious expansion, suffered badly in both panics. The Yerkes' fortune, leveraged heavily against the still unfinished London Underground project, would prove catastrophically vulnerable to exactly this kind of sudden credit contraction. Collis Huntington's holdings, built on physical infrastructure generating steady, unglamorous revenue rather than speculative growth, weathered both storms with comparatively little damage. It is worth remembering this backdrop as Arabella's story moves forward into the moment of her inheritance, because the timing matters enormously. She would inherit her fortune in 1900, in the calm years between these two great storms, and the fortune she inherited would prove sturdy enough to weather the second storm in 1907 without significant damage. Had circumstances been only slightly different? Had Collis Huntington died a few years earlier or later? Had his fortune been structured only slightly differently? This story might have unfolded along an entirely different, far less fortunate path. The year is 1900. Collis Huntington is in his late 70s, and the body that spent 5 decades building railroads across impossible terrain has finally, unremarkably, begun to fail the way every body eventually does, regardless of how many miles of track it once commanded. He dies that August, at his camp in the Adirondacks, among the quiet forests he had increasingly retreated to in his final years, a considerable distance from the boardrooms and construction sites that had defined most of his adult life. You have already watched, earlier in this history, what happened when a different Gilded Age fortune met its maker's death. You have seen the safe drilled open, the bill of sale found too late, the $22 million that dissolved into less than $1 million once the creditors finished their accounting. It would be reasonable, arriving at this chapter, to brace yourself for something similar. It does not come. This is the first meaningful place where Arabella's story diverges from the pattern you have already learned to expect from this century, and the divergence is worth sitting with carefully, because it explains almost everything that follows. Collis Huntington's fortune, unlike so many of his contemporaries, was not a tower built on leverage and appearance. It was built on physical infrastructure, actual railroad track, actual land grants, actual shipping and mining interests that continued generating revenue whether or not anyone was hosting dinner parties to prove their solvency. There were no platinum-plated doors concealing a mortgage. There was, when the lawyers finally opened the books, simply a very large and very real fortune, exactly as advertised. When the estate is settled, Arabella inherits an amount widely reported in the newspapers of the following months as more than $50 million. It is worth pausing to let that figure sit for a moment against everything you have already learned tonight. $50 million in 1900 delivered whole and largely unencumbered to a woman who 3.5 decades earlier had been a teenager in a Richmond boarding house, watching her mother count a stranger's rent twice before spending it once. She does not inherit this fortune quietly, and she does not sit on it passively either. In the years immediately following Collis's death, Arabella becomes, by any reasonable measure, one of the most financially active women in the country. She speculates in real estate with what several accounts describe as genuine talent, not the careless spending of a woman who has simply never had to think about money, but the deliberate manoeuvring of someone who understands, from long practical experience, exactly how fragile a fortune can be if it is not actively tended. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Remember that she had already, decades earlier, purchased a piece of New York property during her leanest years, a property later sold at considerable profit to John D. Rockefeller. The instinct that made that early purchase possible does not disappear once the fortune around her grows 100-fold. If anything, it sharpens. She's not simply a woman who married well. She's a woman who understood, from a very young age and from very hard experience, that money left idle has a way of quietly disappearing, the way it disappeared from 3 fortunes you have already watched dissolve in earlier chapters of this history. She also, in these years, begins the philanthropic work that will occupy much of the rest of her life, and it is worth noting where her generosity lands, because it says something about a woman the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue never fully bothered to understand. She gives substantially to the Hampton Institute and the Tuskegee Institute, both dedicated to the education of black students in the post-war South, at a time when such support was neither fashionable nor expected from a woman of her position. She funds one of the earliest cancer research programs in the country, established at a New York hospital in her late husband's memory, a program that would grow, across the following century, into what is now one of the most significant cancer treatment centers in the world. None of this philanthropy erases the exclusion she had faced for most of her adult life, and it would be dishonest to suggest that the old New York families ever fully softened simply because the checks she wrote were generous. Some doors remained closed to her for the rest of her life, regardless of how much good her money did elsewhere. But something had shifted nonetheless. She was no longer a woman waiting outside a room, hoping to be let in. She was, increasingly, a woman who had built rooms of her own, filled with the beginnings of an art collection that would eventually rival the finest in the country, and populated with institutions that would carry her name, or at least her generosity, long after the families who had shunned her were themselves forgotten. It is worth remembering, at this point in her story, exactly how differently this chapter reads compared to the widows you met earlier in this history. Mary Yerkes discovered her husband's fortune was hollow only after his death, and spent her final years unravelling debts she never knew existed. Anna Gould watched her inheritance converted into pink marble and Mediterranean yacht voyages by a husband who never once let her see the full ledger. Arabella, by contrast, inherits a fortune that is exactly as real as it appears, and spends the years that follow actively growing it rather than discovering too late that it was never real to begin with. The difference was not luck alone, though luck played its part. Collis Huntington's fortune happened to be built on something more durable than the leveraged paper towers his contemporaries preferred. But the difference was also, unmistakably, the woman herself. A widow who had once counted a boarding house stranger's rent twice was not likely to let a $50 million inheritance slip through carelessness. She had learned, decades earlier, and under far harder circumstances, exactly how easily money disappears when nobody's paying close enough attention. There is a quieter dimension to these widowed years worth pausing over as well, one that had nothing to do with money at all. For the first time in her adult life, Arabella answers to no one. Not to a mother counting rent in a Richmond boarding house, not to a dying woman requiring careful, constant attendance, not to a husband whose name, however generously he shared his fortune, still governed the outer shape of her days. Widowhood, for a woman who had spent decades navigating other people's houses and other people's expectations, arrived also as something rarely acknowledged in the histories of the era, a kind of freedom. She travels extensively in these years, moving between New York, Europe, and eventually California, with the particular ease of someone who no longer needs anyone's permission to go anywhere at all. She commissions portraits. She corresponds with dealers and museum directors as an equal rather than a supplicant. Her opinions on authenticity and provenance increasingly sought after rather than merely tolerated. It is a considerable distance from the sick room she once occupied on someone else's schedule, tending someone else's needs. None of this erased the particular loneliness that seems to have shadowed her, according to several accounts, even at the height of her financial independence. A woman who spends decades being talked about rather than talked to does not necessarily find, on the far side of that experience, an easy comfort in company. Some of her contemporaries described her, in these years, as guarded, careful with her trust, quick to test the motives of anyone who approached her with sudden warmth once her fortune became widely known. This wariness, whatever its emotional cost, was not unfounded. A widow holding $50 million in the year 1900 was, by definition, a target for exactly the kind of fortune-seeking attention that had already ruined other women in this history. She had watched, even if only from a distance and through newspaper accounts, what happened to women like Mary Yerkes, whose second marriage to a much younger man collapsed within a year or two, once the money proved less reliable than promised. Arabella, whatever loneliness she carried, did not repeat that particular mistake in haste. She would wait more than a decade before considering marriage again, and when she finally did, it would not be to a stranger chasing a fortune, but to a man who had known her and the family for the better part of 2 decades already. For now, let her rest in this new and unfamiliar position. Not a mistress waiting quietly at the edge of a household, not a companion sitting in a dying woman's sick room, but one of the wealthiest women in America, with more than a decade of independence still ahead of her before the next great turn in this story arrives. It is worth understanding, too, exactly how unusual it was for a fortune of this size to pass so completely intact through a death in this particular era. You have already watched the Gould fortune bleed away across 3 decades of overambitious railroad expansion, the Yerkes fortune revealed as almost entirely hollow the moment his creditors examined it closely. The Castellane portion of the Gould inheritance converted into pink marble and Mediterranean yacht voyages until almost nothing remained. $50 million delivered whole in the year 1900 was not simply good fortune. It was the rare, almost startling exception to a pattern this entire history has spent considerable time establishing. Some of that exception can be credited directly to Collis Huntington's own particular temperament as a businessman. Unlike Boney de Castellane, he had no interest in performance for its own sake. Unlike George Gould, he had learned caution the hard way, across decades of negotiating with rivals who would have gladly bankrupted him given the smallest opening. He built conservatively, relative to his contemporaries, favouring physical assets, track, land, shipping infrastructure, over the kind of leveraged paper positions that had proven so catastrophic for other Gilded Age families once a panic finally arrived to test them. This matters for Arabella's story specifically because it meant she inherited not merely a large sum of money, but a genuinely stable one, insulated to a considerable degree from exactly the kind of sudden collapse that had devastated so many of her contemporaries. She would still need to manage it wisely. Fortunes, however solid their foundation, can still be squandered by careless heirs, as George Gould had already demonstrated with painful clarity. But she began from a foundation that was actually real, which put her, from the very first day of her widowhood, in a fundamentally different position than almost every other widow this history has introduced you to. It is worth pausing before this chapter closes on the small telling detail of how Arabella chose to invest a portion of this new fortune in the years immediately following Collis's death. Rather than simply parking the money in conservative bonds, the safe and expected choice for a widow of her era, she moved actively into real estate speculation in both New York and California, buying and selling with a confidence that surprised more than a few of the professional financiers who dealt with her. It was, in its own quiet way, a continuation of the very first lesson this story ever taught you, that a piece of property bought at the right moment, in one's own name, tends to outlast almost anything else a fortune can be converted into. It is worth reflecting too on how differently the newspapers of 1900 covered Arabella's inheritance compared to how they had covered her marriage 16 years earlier. The scandal of 1884 had been front-page material, dissected and debated across society columns for months. The inheritance of 1900, by contrast, was reported largely as straightforward financial news. The size of the estate, the terms of the will, the scope of her new holdings, with only passing reference to the more colourful details of her earlier history. $50 million, it turns out, has a way of quietly reshaping how a newspaper chooses to describe a woman, whatever it might have said about her 16 years earlier when she had considerably less of it. There is a broader observation available here, worth carrying forward into the chapters ahead. Money, in this century as in most others, functioned as a kind of translator, converting a story that might otherwise have been told entirely in the language of scandal into one increasingly told in the language of business and philanthropy instead. It did not erase the earlier chapter, it simply crowded it, gradually toward the margins of the page, making room for the larger, more respectable story that $50 million was now capable of telling on her behalf. It is worth imagining, too, the particular satisfaction available to a woman managing this scale of fortune entirely on her own terms, without a husband's oversight or a trustee's interference, for the first time in her adult life. Every decision, which properties to sell, which to hold, which philanthropic causes deserved her attention, which art dealers merited her trust, belonged entirely to her, subject to no one else's veto. It is difficult to overstate how rare this particular kind of unencumbered financial autonomy was for any woman of this century, regardless of her wealth, and it is worth sitting with the quiet radicalism of that fact even now, more than a century later. There is a further point worth making about the size of this fortune relative to the American economy of 1900 as a whole. $50 million, in an era before income taxes existed in any meaningful form, and before the federal government had developed anything resembling the modern regulatory apparatus surrounding great wealth, placed Arabella among perhaps a few dozen individuals in the entire country capable of exercising this scale of independent financial influence. That she was a woman, and a woman with her particular history, made her position within that small circle almost entirely without precedent. There was, quite simply, no established model for what a woman in her exact position was supposed to do next, which left her, unusually for this century, largely free to invent her own. The night is deepening now, and so is her story. There is still a second marriage waiting further down this history, one even the newspapers of the time found difficult to fully explain. But for tonight, let her simply sit for a while, in the quiet satisfaction of an inheritance that, unlike so many others in this century, turned out to be exactly what it claimed to be. Every great Gilded Age fortune, once its founder dies, faces the same quiet question, and you have already watched several families answer it badly. Who inherits not just the money, but the judgment that built it? George Gould inherited his father's railroads and none of his father's caution. And you watched, in an earlier chapter, exactly what that mismatch cost an entire family across 3 decades. Collis Huntington's fortune faced a version of the same question in 1900, though it would be answered rather differently. His nephew, Henry Edward Huntington, had spent years working directly beside his uncle, learning the railroad business from the inside in a way George Gould, for all his confidence, never quite managed to learn from his own father. When Collis dies, Henry inherits roughly a third of the estate outright, a substantial fortune in its own right, built on the same durable foundation of actual infrastructure rather than leveraged appearance that had protected Arabella's inheritance from the fate that swallowed so many of her contemporaries. Henry, at the time of his uncle's death, is already married to a woman named Mary Alice Prentice, and by most outward appearances his life follows the conventional path expected of a wealthy man in his position. He continues his uncle's railroad interests, expanding electric streetcar lines that will eventually knit together the scattered towns of Southern California into something resembling a single connected region, the foundation of the transportation network that will define Los Angeles for the following century. But something else is also unfolding quietly in these years, something the newspapers of the time would eventually seize upon with considerable relish once it became impossible to keep private. Henry and Arabella, uncle and widow, nephew and aunt by marriage though not by blood, begin spending increasing amounts of time together, drawn toward each other by what appears, from the historical record, to have been a genuine shared passion for art and collecting, as much as anything more personal. It is worth pausing here to notice something about the shape this attraction takes, because it echoes, almost precisely, the pattern that first brought Arabella into the Huntington family more than 2 decades earlier. Once again, a marriage stands in the way. Once again, patience and proximity slowly work at that obstacle in ways too gradual to draw much notice, until the obstacle is simply, one day, gone. Henry divorces Mary Alice in 1906, a decision that carried real social cost even for a man of his standing, divorce still being a considerably graver matter in respectable society than it would become in later decades. The 2 former spouses remain, by most accounts, on civil terms, and Mary Alice does not disappear into obscurity or hardship. She remains a woman of means, unlike so many of the discarded wives you have already met in earlier chapters of this history. But the marriage that had once defined Henry's domestic life is, formally and legally, over. 7 years pass before Henry and Arabella finally marry in 1913, a gap of time that suggests something more considered than a scandalous rush, whatever the drawing rooms of the previous decade might have whispered about the timing of the divorce itself. When the marriage finally happens, it joins 2 of the largest remaining pieces of the Huntington fortune back into a single household: Arabella's inheritance from Collis and Henry's own considerable wealth, built from his uncle's railroads and his own subsequent business success in California real estate and transit. You might reasonably wonder what to make of a woman who married into one branch of a great fortune, inherited it whole upon her husband's death, and then married again into a second branch of the very same family, reuniting money that might otherwise have drifted generation by generation into entirely separate households. It is by any measure an unusual sequence of events, and it drew exactly the kind of gossip you would expect from a society already primed, by her earlier history, to assume the worst. But look again at the pattern established across every chapter of her life so far. This was not a woman moving through marriages carelessly, chasing whichever fortune happened to be nearest. This was a woman who had learned, from a Richmond boarding house onward, that financial security required active, patient tending, and who consistently chose partners, first a dying woman's husband, later that husband's own nephew, who shared her genuine interest in building something that would outlast a single lifetime. What Henry and Arabella build together, in the years following their marriage, is not simply a larger combined fortune, though it is certainly that. It is a shared project of collecting and preservation that neither of them could likely have built quite so completely alone. Between 1908 and 1917 alone, the two of them spend an estimated $21 million on art, working with the era's most prominent dealers to assemble a collection that includes old masters, Renaissance devotional paintings, and English portraiture, including a particular painting of a boy in a blue satin suit that will become, in time, one of the most recognized images in American museum history. It is worth noticing before this chapter closes how differently this second marriage reads compared to the fortune-draining unions you watched dissolve earlier in this history. Bonnie de Castellane spent Anna Gould's inheritance on a palace of pink marble that stood empty and unloved within a decade of its completion. Henry and Arabella Huntington spend a comparable fortune building something that will still be standing, still welcoming visitors, still teaching schoolchildren about American history more than a century later. The difference, once again, was not simply luck, though a durable railroad fortune certainly helped where a mortgaged aristocratic title had not. The difference was two people who had each, in their own separate histories, already learned the hard lesson that money spent on permanence outlasts money spent on performance. A palace built to impress a Paris dinner party becomes, eventually, a parking lot. A library built to hold knowledge becomes, eventually, a place where knowledge continues to be held. It is worth pausing, too, on Mary Alice Prentice, the wife Henry left behind, because her fate complicates any easy reading of this second marriage as simply another chapter in a woman's long triumph. She was not ruined by the divorce, unlike so many women you have already met in this history whose husbands' choices left them destitute. She retained a comfortable settlement and largely disappears from the historical record afterward, living out her remaining years away from the spotlight that had briefly, uncomfortably, fallen on her marriage's ending. There is something worth noticing in that quiet disappearance at this late hour. Not every wife in this century was destroyed by a husband's decision to leave. Some simply stepped sideways, out of a story that no longer had room for them, and continued their lives elsewhere, off the page, which is its own kind of survival, even if it makes for a less dramatic footnote. The newspapers of 1913, when Henry and Arabella's marriage was finally announced, treated the union with a curiosity that had softened considerably from the outright scandal that had greeted her first marriage nearly 3 decades earlier. Time, money, and an increasingly visible pattern of serious philanthropy had done what nothing else could. They had made her, if not fully respectable by the old standards of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, at least too significant a figure to dismiss outright. The society pages of this later era discuss her collections, her taste, her considerable influence on the art market, far more than they discuss the circumstances of how she first arrived in the Huntington family at all. This shift matters because it demonstrates something the earlier chapters of this story have already suggested, but not yet stated outright. Scandal, in this century, had a half-life. It did not last forever, and it decayed at a rate roughly proportional to how much money and how much genuine accomplishment a woman could pile up on the other side of the scale. Arabella, by 1913, had piled up a great deal of both. It is worth understanding what Henry Huntington had already accomplished in his own right, quite apart from any inheritance, because it matters for how we should read this marriage. He was not a man marrying his way into significance the way Bonnie de Castellane had once done with Anna Gould. He had spent years building electric streetcar lines across the scattered towns surrounding Los Angeles, a project that would eventually become the Pacific Electric Railway, knitting together a sprawling, disconnected region into something resembling a single interconnected metropolis. This was genuine, substantial infrastructure work, the same kind of durable physical achievement that had protected his uncle's fortune from the hollowness that consumed so many of his contemporaries. Two people then, each independently wealthy, each independently accomplished, choosing to combine their households and their considerable collecting ambitions rather than one absorbing the other. It is a meaningfully different shape of marriage than most of the others you have encountered across this history, where one partner's fortune inevitably dominated and eventually devoured the others. Neither Henry nor Arabella needed this marriage for financial survival. They appear, by every available account, to have chosen it instead for the particular pleasure of building something together that neither of them, quite possibly, could have built entirely alone. It is worth noting, too, that the courtship between Henry and Arabella unfolded largely through their shared correspondence about art, letters discussing a particular acquisition, a dealer's reliability, the provenance of a disputed painting. This is, in its own quiet way, a rather different courtship than the one that first brought Collis and Arabella together decades earlier, shaped less by proximity and caretaking than by genuine intellectual partnership between two collectors who had each spent years developing considerable expertise. It suggests something worth noting about how thoroughly Arabella's own identity had shifted across the intervening decades, from a young woman valued primarily for her presence and her patience, to a mature woman valued increasingly for her judgment and her taste. It is worth considering, too, how this second marriage would have looked from the perspective of Archer, now a grown man in his early 40s, watching his mother marry the very relative who now shared, by blood if not by direct inheritance, a portion of the fortune Archer himself had once been adopted into. Family gatherings in these years would have carried a complexity that few, outside the household, could have fully appreciated. An aunt who was also a stepmother, a stepfather who was also a cousin by marriage, an entire web of relation that the century's ordinary vocabulary for family struggled to properly describe. And yet, by every available account, the household functioned with genuine warmth rather than awkwardness, the peculiar geometry of the relationships mattering considerably less, in daily practice, than the shared interests and shared affection that actually held the family together. There is a broader lesson available here as well, one worth carrying forward as this chapter closes. Families in any century are rarely as tidy as the formal charts of inheritance and blood relations suggest they should be. The Huntington family tree by 1913 had bent and doubled back on itself in ways that would have scandalized an earlier generation of genealogists, and yet it produced from all this apparent tangle one of the most enduring philanthropic legacies of the entire Gilded Age. Sometimes the shape a family takes matters considerably less than what that family, however unconventionally assembled, ultimately chooses to build together. It is worth noting, finally, the particular geography of this second marriage as well. Where the first Huntington marriage had unfolded largely on the East Coast, in New York and San Francisco, this second one increasingly centered itself in Southern California, in the ranchlands near Pasadena that Henry had spent years assembling. It was a landscape entirely unlike Richmond, unlike New York, unlike San Francisco. Dry, sun-soaked, still largely agricultural in these years before the region's later, more famous transformation. Arabella, arriving in this new landscape in her 60s, was once again beginning something new in an unfamiliar place, exactly as she had done as a teenager travelling north from Richmond, and again as a young widow beginning her second act in New York's art world. Reinvention, by this point in her life, was simply how she moved through the world. It is worth remembering, too, that this second marriage arrived at a moment when Arabella was already, by any reasonable measure, entirely financially secure on her own. She did not need Henry Huntington's fortune any more than he needed hers. Whatever drew them together across those 7 years between his divorce and their eventual marriage, it was not financial necessity on either side, which makes the union, in its own quiet way, one of the purer examples in this entire history of two people choosing each other simply because they wished to, unclouded by the desperate calculations that had shaped so many of the other marriages this story has already examined. It is worth considering, too, how the wider Huntington business empire continued expanding through these very years, largely undisturbed by the personal reconfiguration happening within the family itself. Henry's streetcar lines kept growing. The railroad interests Collis had built kept generating revenue, now managed by a new generation of executives who had learned the business under his direct supervision. The family's private life, however unconventional its shape, unfolded alongside a business empire that continued operating with the same steady, unglamorous competence that had always characterized the Huntington approach to wealth, a competence this story has already suggested was the real, underlying reason none of it ever collapsed the way so many of the other Gilded Age fortunes eventually did. Let this chapter settle now into quiet. There is still one great project waiting further down this story. A library, a garden, a mausoleum built to hold two people who found each other twice, in two separate decades, on two separate sides of an inheritance neither of them was originally supposed to receive. Before we step into the library itself, it is worth pausing to understand why art and rare book collecting became, for so many Gilded Age fortunes, the preferred vehicle for converting sudden wealth into something resembling lasting cultural legitimacy. New money, in this era, carried a particular kind of social anxiety with it, an awareness that wealth alone, however vast, could not purchase the generations of accumulated prestige that old European aristocracy or old American families like the Astors took for granted. Art collecting offered a shortcut of sorts, a way to surround oneself with objects that carried their own inherent history and cultural weight, borrowing, in effect, the accumulated prestige of a Rembrandt or a medieval manuscript to compensate for a family name that had only existed at the top of society for a single generation. Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, J.P. Morgan, and dozens of other Gilded Age fortunes pursued this same strategy simultaneously, competing with each other across the international art markets of London and Paris, driving prices to levels that would have been unimaginable only a generation earlier. Henry and Arabella Huntington were, in this sense, participating in a broader pattern, rather than inventing something entirely new. What distinguished their particular version of this pattern was the eventual decision to convert their collection into a permanent public institution, rather than simply passing it down, ungoverned, to whichever heir happened to inherit it. It is worth remembering, too, that this collecting impulse served a genuine emotional function beyond its social calculation. For a woman who had spent decades being excluded from rooms she wished to enter, the ability to fill her own rooms with objects of unquestionable beauty and unquestionable historical significance offered a particular kind of quiet satisfaction that no amount of social acceptance could have fully replicated. She was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to possess something of genuine worth. She simply acquired it, on her own judgment, and let the world catch up to her taste in its own time. There is a particular quality to Southern California light in the early years of the 20th century, a clear, dry brightness that the wet grey winters of New York never quite prepared a person for. It is in this light, on a ranch property near Pasadena, that Henry Huntington had been steadily acquiring and expanding for years, that the two of them begin building what will eventually become their most lasting shared achievement. The Huntington Library, art collections, and botanical gardens did not appear all at once, the way a single dramatic gift might, but accumulated the way most things in Arabella's life had always accumulated, steadily, deliberately, over years of careful acquisition rather than one spectacular gesture. Rare books, manuscripts, paintings gathered from estates across Europe and America, assembled not to be displayed once at a party and then locked away, but to be preserved, studied, and eventually shared with a public that had never invited either of them to its private dinner tables. There is something worth sitting with in that choice, at this quiet hour. A woman who spent much of her early adulthood locked out of the rooms where the old families gathered spends the latter half of her life building an entirely different kind of room, one open to scholars, to schoolchildren, to anyone who cares to walk through its gardens or read in its reading rooms, regardless of what name they carry or what boarding house their mother might once have run. You might call this a kind of quiet vindication, if you wanted a tidier ending than history usually provides. It would not be entirely wrong, but it would also flatten something more interesting about what actually happened here, which is that Arabella and Henry were not by most accounts building the library primarily to prove a point to anyone who had once excluded them. They were building it because they had, across their separate lives, developed a genuine and considerable passion for the objects themselves, for the physical weight of a first edition, for the particular brushwork of an English portrait, for the slow, absorbing pleasure of assembling something that mattered beyond its price. This distinction matters because it explains why the collection they built has lasted so much longer and meant so much more than the performances of wealth you have already watched dissolve in earlier chapters of this history. A palace built to impress a dinner party needs constant escalating spectacle to maintain its purpose, and eventually the spectacle exhausts even the fortune funding it. A library built out of genuine interest needs only careful maintenance, and careful maintenance, unlike escalating spectacle, is a project that can actually be sustained across generations. The couple continues their collecting through the 1910s and into the early 1920s, years that also, quietly, bring Arabella something else she had rarely been granted across her long and complicated life, a measure of settled respectability. She is by now in her 70s, a woman whose fortune, whose philanthropy, and whose evident good taste have slowly, grudgingly, worn down at least some of the resistance that had followed her since the Richmond boarding house days. Not every door opens, some never do, but enough have opened by now that her final years carry a kind of quiet dignity. The newspapers of her scandalous middle years would scarcely have predicted. She dies in September of 1924 in New York City, at roughly 73 years old, though even her exact birth year remains, fittingly for a woman whose early life the record keeps losing track of, a matter of some historical uncertainty. Her fortune and her portion of the art collection passed to her son, Archer, the boy born under circumstances the century never fully clarified, now grown into a scholar and philanthropist in his own right, deeply devoted to Hispanic art and literature, a field of study he pursues with the same patient, thorough dedication his mother once brought to real estate speculation and art acquisition alike. Archer, in the years following his mother's death, donates a considerable portion of her paintings to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, including works by Rembrandt and Vermeer that had once hung in her private homes, unseen by anyone outside her own small circle. It is a fitting final gesture from a woman who had spent her whole life converting private, carefully guarded advantage into something that eventually, on her own timeline and no one else's, became public and permanent. Henry Huntington outlives her by 3 years, dying in 1927, and is buried beside her in a mausoleum built on the grounds of the library and gardens they created together. A quiet architectural echo of the two houses, the sick room in New York, the marriage in San Francisco, that had first drawn their family together more than 4 decades earlier. The library itself still stands today, still open to the public, still holding, among its treasures, a small memorial dedicated to Arabella herself, installed in its west wing the year after Henry's death. Consider for a moment the full arc of this particular life, from a Richmond boarding house to a marble mausoleum in San Marino, California. A girl with no fortune becomes a companion, then a wife, then a widow holding one of the largest inheritances in the country, then a wife again, to a man who might, by strict blood relation, have called her his aunt, and finally, in death, a permanent presence in one of the great cultural institutions of the American West. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened without cost. The social exclusion she faced for decades was real, and no amount of eventual philanthropy fully erased it during her own lifetime. But it happened, patiently, decade after decade, in exactly the arithmetic this story opened with. Gifts given while a man could still choose to give them, legal acts converted, one careful signature at a time, into permanent standing that no later dispute could unwind. She was, by the plain measure the newspapers of her era eventually settled on, once called the richest woman in America. It is worth remembering, as this chapter closes, that she began as a girl whose mother counted a stranger's rent twice before spending it once, in a narrow house on a Richmond street that no longer exists. Picture, if you can hold the image gently at this hour, the gardens as they exist today, more than a century after the first acres were planted, rows of camellias older than anyone currently walking among them, a desert garden where cactus specimens from across the world grow in careful, deliberate arrangement, planted originally under the direction of a staff Henry and Arabella employed specifically for that purpose, long before such gardens became a common feature of American estates. A reading room where scholars still consult manuscripts the couple gathered from across 2 continents, each acquisition a small patient act of permanence layered on top of another. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction available to anyone who visits that library today and happens to learn its founding story, the way a visitor might turn a corner in the gardens and encounter, unexpectedly, a small plaque bearing a name that meant almost nothing to the old New York families who once refused to receive her, and now means, to anyone who cares to look, a great deal indeed. It would be too tidy to call this justice exactly. Justice implies some deliberate correction of an old wrong, some reckoning the century itself was forced to make. What actually happened was quieter and stranger than that. Simply time, continuing to pass, continuing to erode the memory of who was and was not received in which drawing room, while the physical, permanent things a woman built with her own patience and her own money continued, undisturbed, to stand. That is perhaps the clearest lesson available in Arabella's story, as we prepare to leave it behind for the night and turn toward two women whose endings will look considerably different from hers. The century's judgment of a woman's worth was never, in the end, the only judgment being kept. There was a second ledger running quietly alongside it, kept not by drawing rooms or newspapers, but by whatever simply managed to last. It is worth noting, too, how deliberately the library itself was designed to outlast any single family's memory of who had built it. Henry and Arabella did not simply will their collection to their heirs, the way so many Gilded Age fortunes were passed down, generation after generation, until some careless descendant eventually scattered what earlier generations had assembled. They established the library as an independent trust, its own institution, governed by its own board, insulated by design from exactly the kind of family mismanagement that had already destroyed the Gould fortune within a single generation. This too is a form of the same arithmetic that has run underneath every story tonight, applied now to an entirely different kind of gift. A fortune left to an heir is a promise, vulnerable to that heir's competence or carelessness. A fortune converted into an independent institution, with its own permanent legal existence, becomes something closer to the executed gifts that protected Arabella and Emilie decades earlier, no longer dependent on any single person's continued good judgment, secured instead by its own structural permanence. Visitors walking those grounds today, unaware of any of this history, simply experience a garden, a library, an afternoon of quiet learning. That, perhaps, is exactly the kind of legacy a woman who spent decades being talked about, rather than talked to, might have most wanted to leave behind. Not a monument to her own name, but a place where the talking finally stops, and something quieter and more permanent takes its place. It is worth pausing before we leave Arabella's story for the night to notice the particular symmetry of her final years. She began her life inside a house filled with strangers, paying for their beds and their meals, her family's own comfort dependent entirely on the goodwill and reliability of people who owed her nothing. She ended it as the presiding presence over a household and a library, built specifically to welcome strangers in, freely, permanently, asking nothing of them beyond their curiosity. The boarding house and the library are, in their own way, mirror images of each other. One built out of necessity, the other built out of abundance, but both, in the end, houses designed to hold people who did not yet belong there until the door was opened. There is a gentleness in that symmetry worth carrying forward as we leave this chapter and turn toward two women whose stories unfolded on a considerably harsher registers. Not every life offers such a clean, satisfying shape. Arabella's did, more or less, though it took the better part of 70 years to fully reveal itself. The two women waiting in the chapters ahead were not so fortunate in how their own stories eventually resolved, and it is worth honouring that difference rather than smoothing it away in service of a tidier narrative. Before we leave her for the night, it is worth naming one final time the specific span of Arabella's life, because the arithmetic of years matters as much here as it has mattered throughout tonight's story. Born around 1850, dead in 1924, she lived through the entire arc this history has traced. The aftermath of the Civil War, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the rise and fall of a dozen other Gilded Age fortunes, the First World War, and the first stirrings of the modern century that would eventually replace the one she had spent her whole life navigating. 70-some years, most of them spent proving, patiently and repeatedly, that a woman born with nothing could still, given enough time and enough careful attention, end up holding almost everything. Before we cross the country and the decades to meet the second woman waiting in tonight's story, it is worth pausing here, in the quiet space between two lives, to consider what actually connects them, since neither woman ever knew the other existed and neither would have recognised much of herself in the other's circumstances at first glance. Arabella's story unfolded across the American West, through legitimate marriage, through a fortune that arrived whole and real. Emilie's story, which begins in the chapter just ahead, unfolds instead in New York, outside any marriage at all, attached to a fortune that would prove, in the end, to be considerably less solid than it appeared. On the surface, these look like two entirely different kinds of lives, governed by entirely different rules. And yet beneath that surface, the same quiet mechanism operates in both stories, patiently, almost invisibly, until you know to look for it. A gift given while a man is alive belongs, immediately and permanently, to the woman who receives it. This was true whether that gift arrived wrapped in the formal legitimacy of marriage, as it did for Arabella, or entirely outside any legal recognition at all, as it did for Emilie. The law cared deeply about the difference between a wife and a mistress when it came to questions of reputation, of social standing, of who was permitted to sit at whose table. It cared considerably less, it turns out, about the difference once the question became simply, who already owns this house, this necklace, this account? It is worth remembering, too, how differently these two women would have experienced the passage of time itself. Arabella spent decades building toward her eventual security, patient across a marriage, a widowhood, a second marriage, each stage adding another layer to a fortune that grew steadily more secure with every passing year. Emilie's security, by contrast, was largely established early, in her first decade with Yerkes, well before anyone, including Emilie herself quite possibly, fully understood how precarious the underlying fortune actually was. She spent her later years not building towards safety, but simply discovering gradually that the safety she already possessed had been real all along. There is a geography worth noting here as well. Arabella's story moves west, from Richmond to New York to San Francisco to the ranchlands of Southern California, tracing the same restless expansion that defined the railroad fortunes of her era. Emilie's story stays largely rooted in a few square blocks of Manhattan, before eventually crossing an ocean entirely, trading one fixed point for another rather than following any westward expansion. Two women, moving through the same country in the same general decades, tracing entirely different paths across its map, yet arriving, each in her own way, at remarkably similar destinations. It is worth remembering, too, that both women's stories intersect in their own ways, with the same broader collapse this history has already traced across earlier chapters: the panics of 1893 and 1907, the slow unravelling of leveraged Gilded Age fortunes, the gradual recognition that paper wealth and real wealth were never quite the same thing. Arabella's fortune survived those panics because it was built on physical infrastructure rather than speculation. The fortune Emilie attached herself to did not survive nearly so cleanly, which makes her eventual security considerably more remarkable, in its own way, than Arabella's. She secured her future from a fortune that was already, quietly, coming apart at the seams without ever fully knowing it at the time. Let this brief interlude close now gently before the next chapter begins in earnest. Two women, 2 decades, 2 blocks of Manhattan and half a continent apart. The arithmetic that connects them was never visible to either one in her own lifetime. It is only visible now from this distance, once all the pieces have finally settled into place. You have already met Charles Tyson Yerkes in an earlier telling of this history, the embezzler turned transit magnate, the man who built street railway empires in Philadelphia and Chicago, before arriving in New York with an art collection, a platinum-doored mansion, and a wife named Mary who believed for decades that the fortune surrounding her was as real as it looked. You know how that particular story ends. $22 million of apparent wealth, $21 million of concealed debt, and a widow left to discover the difference only after the funeral. But there is another household in that same story, one this history only glanced at briefly before, and it deserves its own quiet chapter now, because it follows an arithmetic closer to Arabella's than to Mary's, even though the two women's lives could hardly have looked more different from the outside. Her name is Emilie Grigsby, though at the time this chapter begins she is simply a teenage girl living a considerably more precarious version of the genteel poverty you already watched, shape Arabella's early years. Her father died when she was young. Her mother, left to support 2 children on dwindling means, made a choice the century judged far more harshly than it judged a widow taking in ordinary boarders. She opened what the record delicately describes as a high-end establishment of the kind respectable society did not discuss in polite company, and kept the true nature of her income carefully hidden from her own children, who were sent away to private schools in Ohio, Emilie to an Ursuline convent, her brother to a seminary. It is worth sitting with the particular cruelty of that arrangement for a moment. A mother working in secret and at considerable personal risk to purchase her children a respectable education and a respectable distance from the very trade that was funding it. Emilie grows up, in other words, inside a lie constructed entirely out of love, one that will eventually collapse around her in a way she had no part in creating and no ability to prevent. Through a connection made by her brother, the family becomes acquainted with the Yerkes household. First, according to some accounts, through talk of a possible match with Yerkes' own son, a young man closer to Emilie's age. But it is the elder Charles Yerkes, by now in his 60s, worth by some estimates $25 million or more, who becomes genuinely and lastingly captivated by the 16-year-old girl introduced to him through this connection. You will notice, if you have been paying attention across this history, that 16 is not an incidental detail here. It was the same age at which Yerkes had first noticed his own wife Mary, decades earlier, during his imprisonment for embezzlement in Philadelphia, when she was the teenage girl faithfully visiting his cell and earning, from the prison staff, the nickname his prison angel. The pattern repeats itself with an almost mechanical precision that says less about any individual cruelty and more about how thoroughly this particular kind of arrangement had become, for men of Yerkes' generation and standing, simply an expected feature of a certain kind of fortune. What follows, in the years after this introduction, is not a brief or careless affair, but something closer to a genuine, if deeply unequal, partnership. Yerkes moves his growing family and business interest to New York, and Emilie is not far behind. He installs her not in some discreet hidden arrangement, but in a home of genuine luxury on Park Avenue, only 2 blocks from the mansion where his wife Mary continues to preside over increasingly isolated evenings. This is worth pausing on because it marks the first meaningful difference between Emilie's situation and the ordinary tragic arc you might expect from a story like this. She's not hidden away in some anonymous rented room, dependent on whatever small allowance a man chooses to send when he remembers. She is given openly enough that Manhattan society quickly learns of it, an entire household of her own, furnished, staffed, and unmistakably permanently in her name. The newspapers of the era, once they discover the arrangement, are not kind to her. Society, once it learns the details of her mother's occupation and the true source of the family's earlier respectability, closes its doors with the particular thoroughness it reserved for women who had once been let in on false pretenses and were now being publicly cast back out. Emilie becomes known, in the whispered vocabulary of the era, as a kept woman, a phrase carrying none of the eventual dignity that history would, much later and much more generously, extend to figures like Arabella. And yet, underneath the public humiliation, something quieter and more durable is being constructed, in exactly the same arithmetic that had already secured Arabella's future 2 decades earlier and a continent away. A house given outright, jewellery, gifts, an allowance that flows steadily and substantially regardless of what the newspapers print or which doors close. Whatever Manhattan society thought of Emilie Grigsby, it could not touch what was already quietly and legally hers. The mansion, when finished, is grand enough and mysterious enough in its origins that the press begins calling it, only half in jest, the House of Mystery, a nickname that captures both the fascination and the disapproval the city felt toward the young woman living inside it. It stands, deliberately or not, as a kind of quiet monument to the same principle you have already watched shape Arabella's life. A gift, once given, does not care what the newspapers think of the woman who received it. For now, let this chapter rest here, with a young woman still in her 20s, established in a mansion of her own, watching from a careful distance as the wife 2 blocks away continues hosting dinners for a fortune that neither woman yet understands is beginning quietly to hollow out from the inside. It is worth pausing before we leave this chapter to consider the particular loneliness of Emilie's position in these early years, a loneliness quite different in shape from Arabella's. Arabella, whatever the drawing rooms whispered, had entered her marriage through a legally recognised ceremony, with a name she was entitled to use in any court in the country. Emilie had no such standing, and no realistic path toward acquiring it. Yerkes was already married, and showed no indication, in these years, of any intention to change that fact. Whatever affection existed between them, and by most accounts it appears to have been genuine, It existed entirely outside any framework the law was prepared to recognise or protect. This mattered enormously for how she would have understood her own position, day to day, inside that Park Avenue mansion. Every comfort surrounding her, the servants, the wardrobe, the eventual automobile, existed only as long as Yerkes chose to continue providing it. There was no ceremony behind her, no adoption formalising her place the way Collis Huntington had formalised young Archer's. She lived, in other words, entirely within the present tense of a wealthy man's ongoing goodwill, with no legal claim reaching backward or forward beyond whatever he chose to give her on any particular day. And yet she seems, by the pattern of her later choices, to have understood this precariousness with unusual clarity for a woman still in her 20s. She did not simply enjoy the gifts as they arrived, and spend them as quickly as fashion demanded, the way society assumed a kept woman inevitably would. She held on to property. She allowed her name to be placed formally on deeds, rather than accepting only cash or jewellery that could be more easily disputed later. Whether this reflected careful calculation, or simply the ordinary instinct of a woman who had already learned, from watching her own mother's carefully guarded secret, how quickly a comfortable arrangement could collapse without warning, the record cannot fully say. What can be said is this: by the time this chapter's story reaches its next turn, Emilie Grigsby will have spent the better part of a decade quietly accumulating exactly the kind of durable, already executed security that protected Arabella a generation earlier. Neither woman ever knew the other existed. Both arrived independently at nearly the same conclusion about where safety could actually be found. It is worth pausing too on the particular skill Emilie brought to this arrangement, a skill her convent education, ironically funded by exactly the trade her mother had worked so hard to hide, had inadvertently helped cultivate. She was by every account cultured, well-read, capable of holding her own in conversation with men considerably older and more worldly than she was. This was not simply beauty being traded for security, the crude version of this story the newspapers prefer to tell. It was, at least in part, a genuine intellectual partnership, however unequal in its underlying power, between a man who valued sharp company and a young woman who had been carefully, if unintentionally, prepared to provide it. The wealth Yerkes possessed by this point in his life was, on its surface, staggering. Some estimates placed his fortune above $25 million, a figure that would translate to something approaching $1 billion in far later currency. He had rebuilt this fortune twice already in his life, once after the Philadelphia embezzlement scandal that first introduced him to his eventual wife Mary, and again after the political wars that eventually drove him out of Chicago. A man who has rebuilt a fortune twice tends to develop a particular, almost restless relationship to money, spending it freely, giving it away freely, because he has already proven to himself twice over that he knows how to make more. It is worth considering too the particular vulnerability of a girl in Emilie's exact position, 16 years old and suddenly the object of intense, expensive attention from a man old enough to be her grandfather. The century offered almost no language for discussing the power imbalance inherent in such an arrangement, treating it instead as simply the ordinary way of the world, a girl's beauty and a man's wealth, meeting in the marketplace the same way any other valuable commodities might meet and exchange hands. It would take considerably longer than this particular century for society to develop the vocabulary, let alone the legal protections, to name what was actually happening in households like this one with any real clarity or concern for the young woman at its centre. It is worth noting too that Emilie's brother Braxton, the very connection who had first introduced her to the Yerkes household, occupies an uncertain place in this story, one the historical record does not fully illuminate. Whether he understood at the time what his introduction might set in motion for his younger sister, or whether he simply saw an opportunity for the family's continued comfort without fully weighing its longer consequences, remains one of the story's quieter unanswered questions. Families in this precarious economic position often made these calculations together, out of necessity rather than any individual failure of judgment, weighing a daughter's or sister's prospects against the family's continued survival in ways that later, more comfortable generations would find difficult to fully understand or forgive. It is worth considering too how this early relationship would have appeared to outside observers who did not yet know its full shape. A wealthy older gentleman, a talented young protégé, the kind of patronage arrangement that, on its surface, could have described any number of entirely respectable relationships in this era. Society's judgment, when it eventually arrived not because the arrangement itself was so unusual, but because its true nature became impossible to disguise as anything else once the mansion, the automobile, and the mother's occupation all became public knowledge simultaneously. Discretion, as this story has already suggested, was the load-bearing wall of every arrangement like this one. Once it cracked, everything built on top of it became visible all at once. There is a comparison worth drawing one final time between the beginning of Emilie's story and the beginning of Arabella's, because the parallel runs deeper than mere circumstance. Both women entered their defining relationships as teenagers, both from households shaped by a parent's carefully guarded secret, both eventually finding themselves the object of an older, wealthier man's sustained attention. The century offered both of them essentially the same narrow set of tools to work with. What differed, ultimately, was not the tools themselves, but the underlying solidity of the fortune each woman eventually attached herself to, a difference neither girl could have possibly assessed correctly at 16. Standing at the very beginning of a story neither of them yet understood she was inside. There is a great deal more to this story. An illness in London, a deathbed in a hotel room neither wife nor mistress fully controls, and a will that will surprise almost everyone who reads it, for reasons that have very little to do with what it actually says. But that is a story for the chapter waiting just ahead, once you have rested a while longer in the quiet of this one. It is worth pausing, one final moment, on the ordinary domestic details of these earliest years together, a shared breakfast table, a household staff learning its new mistress's preferences, the slow accumulation of small routines that eventually make any house feel like a home regardless of the unusual circumstances that first assembled it. Whatever judgment the century eventually rendered on this household, it was, in its own quiet daily rhythms, simply a life being lived, one ordinary morning at a time. Before we step further into the House of Mystery, it is worth understanding a little more about the particular business that made Charles Yerkes's fortune possible, because it shaped almost everything about the household you're about to enter. Urban transit in the final decades of the 19th century was, in most American and European cities, a chaotic patchwork of competing private companies, each operating its own horse-drawn or, increasingly, electric streetcar lines, with little coordination between them and even less concern for the passengers caught navigating the resulting confusion. A man who could consolidate these fragmented systems into a single, coherent, efficiently operated network stood to profit enormously, both from the transit fares themselves and from the real estate that inevitably grew more valuable once reliable transportation connected it to a city's centre. Yerkes understood this dynamic with unusual clarity, and he pursued it with a ruthlessness that made him simultaneously very wealthy and very unpopular. In Chicago, his consolidation of the city's streetcar lines involved extensive bribery of local officials, manipulation of franchise agreements and business tactics, aggressive enough that reform newspapers eventually ran him out of the city entirely. He arrived in New York already wealthy from these earlier campaigns, and he would spend his final years attempting the same consolidation on an even grander scale beneath the streets of London. It is worth understanding, too, that this entire business model depended on leverage, borrowing heavily against future revenue to fund present acquisitions and construction, a strategy that worked brilliantly as long as growth continued uninterrupted and collapsed catastrophically the moment it did not. This is, in miniature, the same pattern that destroyed the Gould fortune and hollowed out the apparent wealth surrounding the Yerkes household on Fifth Avenue. The men who built these transit empires were not, in most cases, building on bedrock. They were building on the confident assumption that tomorrow's revenue would always be large enough to cover today's borrowing, an assumption that eventually, inevitably, proved false. This is the financial weather system operating quietly behind every scene in the chapters ahead. The mansion, the automobile, the House of Mystery itself. None of it was built on the solid ground Arabella's fortune eventually rested on. All of it was balanced, precariously, on a man's continued ability to keep borrowing against a future that would, in the end, arrive considerably less kindly than anyone in either household expected. Picture Park Avenue in the first years of the new century, not yet the canyon of tall apartment buildings it will become decades later, but still a street of substantial private houses, each one a small fortress of brick and stone announcing, in its own careful architecture, exactly how much money had been spent to build it. 2 blocks from the Yerkes mansion on Fifth Avenue, with its platinum-plated doors and its gallery of old masters, sits a smaller but no less carefully appointed house. And inside it lives a young woman the neighbourhood has learned, gradually and reluctantly, to call by name. The house itself becomes, in its own quiet way, a kind of character in this story. Furnished with the same taste and expense that Yerkes brought to every project he touched, it draws a particular kind of fascinated attention from a city that could not decide whether to be scandalised or simply curious. Who is this woman? Where did her fortune, however borrowed it might be, actually come from? Why does a man already married to one of the most visible wives in New York society maintain a second household so openly, so unapologetically, so close to the first? The press, when it finally uncovers the answer to that last question about her mother's occupation, treats the revelation as confirmation of everything it had already suspected. A woman with a past like that, the reasoning went, could hardly be surprised to find herself living exactly the kind of life the newspapers had already assumed she was destined for. It is a particularly unforgiving piece of Gilded Age logic, one that punished daughters for the choices their mothers had made to protect them, and it followed Emilie for the rest of her time in New York. And yet inside the House of Mystery, whatever the newspapers said about it, life continues on a scale of genuine comfort that most of the city's respectable, socially acceptable households could not have matched. There are servants. There is an ever-expanding wardrobe. There is, by several accounts, one of the earliest private automobiles owned by a woman in her position, a Columbia Hanson acquired in 1903 that becomes, in its own small way, a kind of talking point among a certain set of New Yorkers who found themselves, despite their disapproval, unable to stop discussing her. It is worth noting in passing that Mary Yerkes, upon learning of this particular acquisition, insisted on a custom vehicle of her own, a small and slightly poignant detail that captures something essential about the strange parallel competition running underneath this entire story. 2 women, 2 blocks apart, each measuring her own worth against the others, neither one fully understanding in these years how differently their 2 positions would ultimately be protected once the man funding both households was gone. Yerkes himself, meanwhile, is increasingly occupied with the project that will consume the final years of his life and, ultimately, a considerable portion of his fortune, the electrification and expansion of the London Underground. He begins spending extended periods across the Atlantic, and by several accounts it is Emilie herself, eager to establish a social standing abroad that New York's closed doors had denied her at home, who encourages the move most enthusiastically. If New York would not receive her, perhaps London, with its different customs and its own long tradition of quietly accommodating a wealthy man's private arrangements, might prove more forgiving. The plan, whatever its precise motivations, works only partially. Emilie does travel with Yerkes to London during these years, and she does find, in certain circles at least, a warmer reception than Manhattan society had ever offered her. But the fundamental shape of her situation does not change. She remains, in the eyes of both the law and respectable opinion on either side of the Atlantic, a woman with no formal claim on the fortune surrounding her, dependent entirely on the continued goodwill of a man now well into his 60s, whose health, after decades of relentless work and transatlantic travel, is beginning quietly to fail. You might reasonably wonder at this point in the story whether Emilie herself understood the precariousness of her position, whether she recognised how much her future depended on decisions Yerkes might or might not make in his final years. The historical record offers no diary, no private letter that settles the question definitively. What it does offer is a pattern of behaviour that, in hindsight, looks a great deal like quiet, deliberate preparation. A woman who continued accepting gifts, continued allowing her name to be placed on deeds and accounts, continued, in other words, converting affection into something more permanent, exactly as Arabella had done a generation earlier and a continent away, without either woman ever meeting or knowing the other's story. Whether this was calculation or simply the ordinary accumulation that happens naturally over years of genuine devotion, the historical record cannot fully say, and perhaps it does not need to. What matters, as this story moves toward its next chapter, is not why the gifts accumulated, but that they did, steadily, year after year, while a wife 2 blocks away continued believing that her own eventual security rested safely inside a will and an estate she had never once been permitted to examine. Consider for a moment the peculiar geography of this arrangement. 2 households, 2 blocks apart, each one aware of the other in a way that must have coloured every ordinary errand, every walk down the avenue, every glance from a passing carriage. New York in this era was, for all its size, a remarkably small world at the level of wealth these 2 women occupied. The same dressmakers, the same jewellers, the same handful of streets where a woman of means was expected to be seen. It is difficult to imagine either Mary or Emilie ever fully escaping awareness of the other, even on the days neither wished to think about it at all. There is something almost architectural about the way this century organised its cruelties, keeping the wife and the mistress close enough to feel each other's presence constantly, yet separated by a legal and social distance neither could cross in either direction. Mary could not simply invite Emilie to tea and negotiate some workable peace, however practical that might have been. Emilie could not simply present herself at the Fifth Avenue mansion and claim any place at its table. Each woman was confined to her own 2-block radius of the same fundamental situation, permitted only to imagine from a careful distance what was happening inside the other's walls. It is worth remembering, too, that Yerkes himself moved between these 2 households with what appears, from the historical record, to have been remarkably little apparent guilt or hesitation. He had, after all, built his fortune on exactly this kind of confident boundary crossing, moving between Philadelphia and Chicago and New York and eventually London, rebuilding his reputation and his wealth each time from whatever fragment survived the last collapse. A man who could reinvent his entire financial life after a prison sentence was, perhaps, not the kind of man likely to be troubled by maintaining 2 households 2 blocks apart from each other. The particular cruelty of this arrangement fell, as it so often did in this century, almost entirely on the 2 women navigating it, rather than on the man who'd created it. Mary's isolation grew more complete with each passing year, her drinking, according to several unflattering newspaper accounts, worsening alongside her increasing social withdrawal. Emilie's isolation took a different shape, not withdrawal into a single house, but a kind of permanent, low-grade exile from the respectable city around her, tolerated for her wealth and her beauty, but never fully accepted by anyone whose acceptance might have mattered. It is worth understanding, too, the ambition that drove Yerkes's final great project across the ocean, because it explains why he was willing to leave both households behind for months at a stretch during these years. London in 1900 was a city choking on its own transportation problems, its underground railways scattered across competing private companies, with no unified system connecting them. Yerkes saw in this exactly the kind of consolidation opportunity he had already exploited twice before, in Philadelphia and Chicago, a fragmented transit system ripe for a single ambitious operator, willing to buy, merge, and electrify it into something coherent. It would prove, in the end, both his greatest achievement and the project that finally exhausted him. The London Underground project consumed enormous sums of capital, much of it borrowed against assets that existed precariously in New York, the very mansion, the very art collection, the very fortune that Mary Yerkes believed to be standing on solid ground. Every dollar poured into London tunnels was a dollar quietly subtracted from the appearance of wealth surrounding Fifth Avenue, though nobody watching the platinum doors and the old master paintings from outside could have possibly guessed it. It is worth reflecting, too, on how the 2 household servants and staff would have understood their own positions inside this unusual arrangement. A footman or a maid working in the Fifth Avenue mansion would have known, in the way household staff always know the private truths their employers prefer to keep hidden from the wider world, exactly what was unfolding 2 blocks away. Domestic staff of this era were remarkably well informed about their employers' private lives and remarkably discreet about sharing that information outside their own circles, bound by an unspoken code that protected the household's secrets even as it privately judged them. The House of Mystery was, in this sense, never quite as mysterious to the people who worked inside either home as it was to the newspaper-reading public outside. It is worth imagining, too, the particular quality of an ordinary evening inside the House of Mystery, away from the newspapers and the scandal, simply as a matter of daily life. Dinner served at a table set for 2, or occasionally for a small circle of the handful of friends who did not care about the whispers. An evening spent reading, or at the theatre, in whichever box the household's considerable resources could still secure despite the doors closed elsewhere. It would be easy from this distance to imagine Emilie's life as one long, continuous performance of scandal, but most of any life, however unconventional its circumstances, consists of ordinary hours, meals, conversations, small domestic routines, largely indistinguishable from the ordinary hours filling any other comfortable household in the city, however differently the neighbours might have judged the two. It is worth considering, too, how the automobile itself, still a genuine novelty in 1903, functioned as its own small marker of status and rivalry between these two households. A Columbia Hanson was, at this early date, a considerable technical achievement as much as a luxury, electric-powered, quiet in a way the earliest gasoline vehicles were not, requiring a level of mechanical sophistication and expense that placed it well beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest families in the country. That both households felt compelled to possess one, essentially simultaneously, says something about how thoroughly this unspoken competition extended even into the smallest details of daily life, each woman measuring her own position against the others in ways large and small, visible and private, for as long as the arrangement lasted. It is worth remembering, too, that the House of Mystery nickname itself, however mocking in its origin, inadvertently captured something true about the entire arrangement. Mystery, after all, was the precise commodity this household traded in. Mystery about its funding, mystery about its owner's true relationship to the man who built it, mystery sustained deliberately by a press that found ambiguity considerably more profitable to report on than any settled, boring truth would have been. The city preferred its scandal served with a question mark rather than a period, and Emilie's household obliged, whether she intended it to or not, for the better part of a decade. It is worth pausing, too, on the particular vantage point available to the servants and staff of both households, the people whose daily labour kept both homes running smoothly, regardless of what their employer's private arrangement might have looked like from the street. A lady's maid dressing Emilie for an evening at the theatre, a butler managing correspondence at the Fifth Avenue mansion, sorting invitations that had grown thinner each season. These were the people who witnessed, at closest range, the actual daily texture of an arrangement the newspapers only ever glimpsed from a careful, speculative distance, and it is worth remembering that their silence, their discretion, their willingness to simply do their jobs without commentary, was itself a quiet, essential piece of the machinery that allowed both households to continue functioning at all. Let the House of Mystery settle into stillness now, its lamps dimming one by one down the length of Park Avenue. Somewhere across the ocean, in a city still unfamiliar to both women, an illness is about to begin that will bring this entire quiet arrangement, along with the much louder marriage 2 blocks away, to its final and most revealing chapter. London, in the summer of 1905, is not a comfortable place to be seriously unwell if you are 68 years old and have spent the better part of 4 decades pushing your body through the particular strain that comes with building, unmaking and rebuilding fortunes on 2 continents. Charles Yerkes falls ill while overseeing the Underground Railway project that has consumed his final years, and for 5 weeks it is Emilie who remains at his bedside, nursing him through an illness serious enough that his greatest remaining ambition, the full consolidation of the London Underground, will ultimately go unfinished. He recovers enough to sail home, but the recovery does not last. Back in New York that autumn, his health begins its final decline, and in a detail that tells you almost everything you need to know about the true architecture of this marriage, he does not return to the Fifth Avenue mansion where his wife waits. He takes a suite instead at the Waldorf Astoria, and it is there, in a hotel room rather than his own home, that his final weeks unfold. You have already watched, in an earlier telling of this same history, what Mary Yerkes does during these weeks. While her husband lies ill across the city, she hires a locksmith to drill open the safe in her own house, the combination to which he had never once shared with her across their entire marriage, and discovers, among the papers inside, a bill of sale dated nearly a decade earlier, evidence that he had been quietly liquidating assets far longer than she had ever suspected. It is the first crack in a fortune that will, within months of his death, prove to be almost entirely hollow. But there is a second scene unfolding simultaneously, 2 blocks and an entire moral universe away, that this history has not yet fully shown you, As Yerkes's condition worsens at the Waldorf, it is not his wife's name he calls for. According to the newspaper accounts of the time, his request for Emilie's presence becomes so persistent and so urgent that his own physician, weighing the medical risk of upsetting a dying man against the social impropriety of admitting his mistress to his deathbed, ultimately decides that her presence is medically necessary and advises, in language the newspapers reported with evident fascination, against Mary's own visit instead. Sit with that reversal for a moment. A dying man's physician, in the final days of 1905, judging a wife's presence as the thing too dangerous to allow, and a mistress's presence as the thing medically required. It is difficult to imagine a clearer, more literal illustration of how completely the emotional centre of this marriage had shifted away from the woman who held its legal title. Emilie remains constantly at his side through those final days, her distress, by every account, entirely genuine rather than performed. Yerkes dies on December 29th, 1905, with Mary and her sister waiting in an adjoining room rather than at the bedside itself. Mary considers, in the final moments, going to him after all, before telling her sister that it is too late now, and afterward offering only the plain, unsentimental verdict that she believes she did right because he had treated her shamefully. It is worth remembering, before we go further, that Mary's grievance was not unfounded. Whatever cold financial arithmetic this chapter is tracing, it does not erase the genuine cruelty of a marriage in which a husband openly maintained a second household 2 blocks away and in his final hours called for the other woman by name. Both women in this story were navigating a set of rules neither of them had written, and both, in their own ways, paid heavily for a man's choices that were never really theirs to make. What happens next in the settling of the estate is where this particular story takes its most striking turn. There are reports circulating in the newspapers shortly after Yerkes's death that he had begun preparing a second will in his final days, one that would have left a substantial portion of his fortune directly to Emilie rather than to his wife and children. His physician, judging him too weak and too compromised to execute such a significant legal document, refused to allow him to sign it. The revised will, whatever it might have contained, was never finalised. Formally, legally, Emilie Grigsby is left with nothing. And here is the detail that makes this chapter worth telling at all, the detail that separates Emilie's story from a simple tragic footnote and turns it instead into the second great illustration of the arithmetic this entire night has been quietly building toward. It did not matter. The fortune Yerkes left behind, once his creditors finished their accounting, turns out to be almost as hollow as it had appeared solid. The mansion mortgaged, the art collection pledged against loans for the London Underground project, the estate reduced from an apparent $22 million to less than $1 million once the true debts were settled. Being excluded from that particular will cost Emilie nothing, because there was almost nothing left in it to exclude her from. What she had, instead, was everything Yerkes had already given her, years earlier, while he was alive, and the giving was entirely his own choice. The Park Avenue mansion, already deeded to her, the jewels, already in her possession, the cash, already settled in accounts that carried only her name. None of it belonged to the estate the creditors were dismantling, because none of it had belonged to Yerkes at all, not since the day he had handed it over. Mary Yerkes, holding the legally superior claim, the recognised title of widow, the formal standing the entire century's laws were supposedly built to protect, ends up with almost nothing. Emilie Grigsby, holding no legal claim whatsoever, formally erased from the final accounting entirely, ends up secure. It is the same arithmetic that carried Arabella from a Richmond boarding house to one of the great libraries of the American West, arriving here in a considerably darker, more contested setting, but arriving nonetheless at very nearly the same conclusion. It is worth sitting for a moment with how differently the newspapers of the day treated these two outcomes, because their coverage tells you almost as much about the century as the outcomes themselves. Mary's discovery of the concealed debts was reported with a kind of grim sympathy, a wronged widow finally learning the truth. Emilie's exclusion from the will, and the rumours of the unsigned second document, were reported instead with barely concealed relish, treated as a scandalous footnote rather than the far more significant financial event it actually turned out to be. Nobody, at the time, seems to have fully grasped that the woman written out of the will had actually fared better than the woman the will was theoretically meant to protect. This is, in its own way, the clearest illustration this entire story has to offer of how thoroughly the century's moral judgments and its financial realities had come apart from each other. The newspapers wanted a story about a virtuous wronged wife and a scheming punished mistress. What actually happened was almost the exact opposite, and it happened in plain sight, in probate filings and estate accountings that anyone could have examined closely enough to notice, if anyone had thought a mistress's finances worth examining closely at all. There is a lesson here worth carrying forward into the remaining chapters of tonight's story gently, without insisting on it too hard. The public account of who wins and who loses in a scandal is not always the same as the private financial account of who actually ends up secure. Sometimes the two align. Often, in this particular century, they did not, and the women who understood that gap, whether by instinct or hard experience, tended to fare considerably better than the ones who trusted the public account to reflect the truth of their circumstances. Consider, too, the Waldorf Astoria itself as a setting for this final scene, because the choice of location carries its own quiet meaning. Yerkes did not die in the mansion that bore his name and displayed his art collection, the house that was, in every legal sense, his primary residence. He died in a hotel, a space belonging to no one in particular, neutral ground between two households that could never openly acknowledge each other. Even in his final hours, it seems, he could not quite choose between the two lives he'd built, and so he chose, instead, a room that belonged to neither. The physician's decision to admit Emilie rather than Mary during those final days would have required, we can imagine, a considerable weighing of professional duty against social convention. Doctors in this era operated under a code that placed the patient's immediate well-being above almost every other consideration, and a dying man's evident distress, calling repeatedly for a woman not his wife, would have presented a genuine ethical puzzle for any physician attending him. That the doctor ultimately sided with medical necessity over social propriety tells you something about how urgent and how visible Yerkes's need for Emilie's presence must have been in those final hours. It is worth pausing, too, on Mary's own words in the immediate aftermath, because they reveal a woman who understood, with unusual clarity for the moment she was in, exactly what had just happened to her marriage, even if she did not yet understand what had happened to her fortune. "He treated me shamefully," she said, offering no softer explanation, no attempt to smooth over 4 decades of a marriage that had begun with her faithfully visiting a prison cell and ended with her husband calling for another woman's name as he died. It is a plain, unadorned verdict, delivered without self-pity, from a woman who had already endured more than most marriages of this era ever demanded. There is a final irony worth noting before this chapter closes, one the newspapers of 1905 never quite managed to articulate, even as they reported every other detail of this scandal in exhaustive length. The unsigned second will, the one that reportedly would have left a substantial sum directly to Emilie, was in the end entirely unnecessary. Had Yerkes lived long enough to sign it, had his physician permitted the exertion, the document would have simply confirmed, formally and belatedly, an arrangement that had already been secured years earlier through simpler, quieter means. The drama of the unsigned will makes for a better story than the truth, which is considerably less dramatic, that the entire question had already been settled, in Emilie's favour, long before anyone thought to draft a second document at all. It is worth reflecting, too, on the funeral itself, and on the particular cruelty of Mary's decision to station detectives at the door to keep Emilie away. Grief, even complicated grief, even grief shadowed by decades of humiliation, is rarely improved by exclusion enforced at gunpoint's remove. And yet Mary's decision is entirely understandable on its own terms as well. A wife who had spent years watching her husband's attention drift 2 blocks away, finally granted, in this one final ceremony, the sole authority to decide who was permitted to mourn him and who was not. It is one of the few moments in this entire story where Mary Yerkes exercised genuine, uncontested power, and she used it, in the end, to close a door that had been left open far too long. It is worth noting, finally, how the two households' fates diverged almost immediately in the days following the funeral. Mary Yerkes remained in the Fifth Avenue mansion just long enough to watch the creditors begin their work. The art collection catalogued for auction, the household staff informed their positions would not continue. Emilie, 2 blocks away, remained undisturbed in a home that no creditor had any legal claim against, her jewellery case untouched, her allowance already spent and irretrievable by anyone who might have wished it back. The distance between those two blocks had never mattered more than it did in the first weeks of 1906, when one household began dismantling itself and the other simply continued exactly as it had the week before. It is worth remembering one final time the peculiar mercy hidden inside this entire chapter's cruelty. Had Yerkes died wealthy, truly wealthy, with the fortune everyone believed he possessed still intact, Mary's position would have been unassailable, and Emilie's exclusion from the will would have meant real, catastrophic loss. It was only because the underlying fortune had already hollowed out quietly, over years of leveraged borrowing for the London project, that the will's contents mattered so little in the end. The safe on Fifth Avenue, standing open and nearly empty, was in its own strange way the very thing that made the House of Mysteries' continued comfort possible. Two facts that seemed, on the surface, entirely unrelated, but that were in fact two sides of the very same hollow fortune. Let this chapter close on that quiet, uncomfortable reversal, the safe on Fifth Avenue standing open and nearly empty, and 2 blocks away, a mansion that never needed a will at all, because everything inside it had already, years earlier, been given away for good. Before we follow Emilie into the long quiet decades that make up the rest of her story, it is worth taking a brief detour to see what became of the project that consumed Charles Yerkes's final years, and ultimately a considerable portion of the fortune surrounding both households. The London Underground electrification and consolidation project that Yerkes had poured himself into, borrowing heavily against assets in New York to fund construction, in a city and ocean away, did not die with him. His associates and successors continued the work, and within a few years of his death, the unified underground system he had envisioned was largely complete, connecting lines that had once operated as entirely separate, incompatible companies into something resembling the coherent network that still carries millions of London commuters today. There is a bitter irony worth sitting with here. The project that hollowed out Yerkes's apparent fortune, that left his widow discovering an empty safe and an estate reduced to a fraction of its reported value, eventually succeeded exactly as he had envisioned it. He simply did not live long enough to see it succeed, and the fortune that might have rewarded that success had already been spent, borrowed, and leveraged well past the point of recovery by the time the profits finally began to materialize. It is worth remembering this pattern, because it recurs throughout this entire history in different forms. George Gould's railroad expansions, similarly over-leveraged, eventually proved sound investments decades later, long after the Gould family had lost control of them. Ambition in this century often arrived slightly ahead of the capital required to sustain it, and the men who bridged that gap through heavy borrowing frequently did not live to see their bets finally pay off, leaving their families to absorb the losses while someone else, later, collected the eventual gains. The underground itself, still operating today, carries no obvious trace of the man who once staked his fortune and his family's security on its completion. His name appears in histories of the system as a footnote, a controversial American financier who helped consolidate its early lines. The tunnels remember nothing of the mansion, the mistress, the empty safe, or the widow left to sort through the wreckage. They simply continue carrying passengers, exactly as intended, indifferent to the very human cost of their own construction. There is a particular kind of aftermath that follows scandal once the newspapers move on to some newer, louder story, and it is this quieter aftermath rather than the scandal itself that occupies the remaining decades of Emilie Grigsby's life. She does not marry the fortune into a second grand household the way Arabella did. She does not become a celebrated philanthropist whose name eventually softens the city that once shunned her. She simply, patiently, continues living on the resources already secured to her for nearly 6 decades after the man who provided them is gone. In the years immediately following Yerkes' death, she continues residing in the Park Avenue mansion, maintaining much of the lavish standard of living she had grown accustomed to, entirely independent of the collapse unfolding 2 blocks away, where Mary Yerkes was discovering the full extent of her husband's hidden debts, watching the art collection auctioned off to distressed buyers, watching the household staff dismissed one by one. Emilie's household, by contrast, continues largely undisturbed, a strange and telling contrast between 2 women who had spent years measuring their worth against one another, only to discover, after his death, how completely their fortunes had already diverged. By 1911, Emilie makes a decision that closes one chapter of her life and opens another. She sells the New York estate and relocates to England, the country that had once, briefly and imperfectly, offered her a warmer reception than Manhattan society ever managed. It is worth noting that this move happens the same year Mary Yerkes dies. At 54, her own brief second marriage to a young fortune hunter already dissolved, her fortune reduced to a fraction of what the newspapers had once assumed she possessed. Two women, once locked in an unspoken competition 2 blocks apart, arrive at entirely different destinations in the very same year, one to a quiet grave, largely forgotten within a season, and the other to a new life across an ocean, still comfortably provided for. In England, Emilie settles into a life the historical record describes only in fragments, the way it so often does for women whose stories were never considered important enough to document thoroughly in their own time. She maintains her considerable comfort. She grows, by several accounts, increasingly private, her earlier bitterness toward the New York society that had rejected her hardening, over the years, into a settled, permanent distance. She does not return to America to reclaim any place in the social world that had once so thoroughly excluded her. She simply lives, comfortably and quietly, on the far side of the Atlantic, for decade after decade after decade. Consider the sheer scale of the time involved here, because it is easy at this sleepy hour to let numbers slide past without their full weight registering. Yerkes dies in December of 1905. Emilie Grigsby does not die until 1964. That is 59 years, not months, not a handful of comfortable years before some inevitable reckoning, but nearly 6 full decades, an entire span of history stretching from the horse-drawn carriages of Edwardian London through 2 world wars and into the era of jet travel and television, all of it lived out in the quiet, sustained comfort of gifts given to her as a teenager by a man who had been dead since before most of that century had even happened yet. It is worth pausing to notice what 59 years actually contains. The London Underground project Yerkes never lived to see completed becomes, across those decades, one of the most extensive transit systems in the world. The Fifth Avenue mansion, with its platinum doors and its gallery of old masters, is demolished, replaced eventually by a garden, and then by whatever came after the garden. 2 world wars reshape the entire structure of European society, and Emilie, now an elderly woman by the time the second of them arrives, lives through all of it on the far side of an ocean, in a stability that a girl born to a mother running a secret establishment in 19th century America could never have reasonably expected to last even a single decade, let alone 6. There is no grand final act to her story, no library built in her name, no institution carrying her legacy forward the way Arabella's does. She does not appear to have converted her private security into the kind of public philanthropy that eventually purchased Arabella a measure of grudging respectability. Whether this reflects a difference in temperament, in opportunity, or simply in how differently the 2 women's early lives had shaped their relationship to money and to the society that had judged them, the historical record does not clearly say. What the record does show, plainly and consistently, is duration. A woman written out of a will, publicly shamed by a mother's occupation she had no part in choosing, banished from the respectable drawing rooms of 2 major cities on 2 different continents, nonetheless outlives every single person who ever judged her for it. She outlives the wife who competed with her for a dying man's attention by 53 years. She outlives the century's assumption that a kept woman's story must end in ruin by nearly 6 full decades. This is perhaps the quietest and least dramatic form the arithmetic of this story can take. Not a triumphant second marriage into an even greater fortune, not a library or a hospital wing built in her name, simply time itself, accumulating patiently around a foundation of gifts given decades earlier, holding steady long after every louder, more respectable fortune in this history had already collapsed, been auctioned, or quietly run out. Let her rest now in that long English quiet, an old woman by the time her story finally ends in 1964, having spent nearly 6 decades proving, without ever intending to prove anything at all, that a gift given while a man could still choose to give it outlasts almost every promise the century's laws were ever willing to make on a wife's behalf. It is worth imagining gently what those decades might actually have felt like from the inside, rather than simply reciting the dates that bookend them. An English countryside changing slowly around her, hedgerows and church bells and the particular grey light of an English afternoon, so different from the harsh bright glare of the New York summers she had left behind. A woman growing older in rooms she had chosen herself, answering to no husband, no society column, no drawing room's verdict on her worth, simply living, quietly, on her own schedule for year after uninterrupted year. There would have been losses along the way, of course. The ordinary losses that accumulate across nearly 6 decades of any life. Friends outlived, a body that slowed and eventually needed more care than it once had. The particular melancholy of being one of the last people alive who remembered a scandal that everyone else had long since forgotten ever happened. Longevity, even comfortable longevity, is rarely painless. It simply trades one set of difficulties for another, quieter set, spread out gently across a much longer span of time. But set against the alternative, against Mary Yerkes's 54 years and her collapsed second marriage, against the platinum doors demolished and replaced by a garden, against an entire fortune that turned out to be built on nothing, Emilie's long English quiet reads, even accounting for its own private difficulties, as something close to a victory. Not a loud one, not one anyone celebrated at the time, or likely even fully understood as it was happening. But a victory nonetheless, measured the only way this story has ever measured anything, in years accumulated safely on a foundation that nobody could take back. It is worth imagining, too, the particular strangeness of living through the 20th century's great upheavals from the quiet vantage point of a private, comfortable English household. The First World War arrives when Emilie is still a woman in her early middle age, reshaping the entire continent she had chosen to call home, and she would have watched it unfold from whatever distance her considerable resources allowed her to maintain. The Second World War arrives when she is elderly, London itself enduring bombardment during years when a woman of her age and means would have had every reason to seek whatever safety her money could still purchase. She survives both, outlasting not only the scandal of her youth, but 2 of the most destructive conflicts in human history, still living quietly on the foundation a dead man had built for her nearly 6 decades earlier. There is something almost unbearably patient about a life shaped this way, and it is worth sitting with that patience one final time before we move on. 59 years is not a headline. It does not fit neatly into a newspaper column the way a scandal does, or a murder, or a spectacular financial collapse. It is simply time, accumulating quietly the way it always does, indifferent to whether anyone outside the household is still paying attention. It is worth wondering, too, whether Emilie ever learned what became of Mary Yerkes in those final years, whether news of the 54-year-old widow's death in 1911 ever reached her, whether she felt anything at all upon hearing it, relief perhaps, or a distant, complicated grief for a woman she had never been permitted to know except as a rival 2 blocks away. The record offers no answer. It is one of the many silences this story has had to leave standing, unresolved, because the women living through it left so little of their private thoughts behind for anyone to later recover. It is worth noting, too, that Emilie never remarried, choosing instead to remain, for the remainder of her long life, a woman who managed her own affairs entirely on her own terms. This, too, marks a meaningful contrast with Mary Yerkes, whose hasty second marriage to a much younger fortune hunter collapsed almost immediately once the extent of her true circumstances became apparent. Emilie, having already learned once the danger of depending entirely on a single man's continued goodwill, appears to have decided that whatever companionship her remaining decades might offer, she no longer required a husband's name to secure her comfort. She had, after all, already secured it herself decades earlier, through gifts a husband's name could never have improved upon. Consider, too, the sheer breadth of change Emilie's life spanned, from a girl attending an Ursuline convent school in rural Ohio to an elderly woman living through the aftermath of 2 world wars in England. The horse-drawn carriages of her youth gave way to automobiles, then to airplanes crossing the very ocean she herself had crossed by steamship. The gaslit New York she had once known, with its platinum-doored mansions and its rigid social hierarchies, gave way to a city she would scarcely have recognized by the time of her death, its skyline utterly transformed, its old families largely forgotten, its scandals of 1905 reduced to a curious footnote in a handful of history books. She lived, in other words, through the complete unmaking of the world that had once judged her so harshly, and outlasted it thoroughly enough to have simply watched it become history. It is worth imagining, one final time, the particular quality of an ordinary English afternoon in Emilie's later decades. Tea taken in a quiet drawing room, a newspaper from a country not her own, the accumulated small comforts of a life built entirely on her own terms, however unconventionally that life had begun. There is a dignity available in that image that the newspapers of 1900 could never have predicted for the 16-year-old girl they had once so gleefully scandalized, and it is worth letting that dignity stand, uncontested, as this chapter finally closes. It is worth holding, one final time, the sheer contrast between the 2 blocks of Manhattan this story keeps returning to, and the quiet English countryside where it eventually settled. New York in these decades was transforming itself at a dizzying pace, skyscrapers rising where mansions had once stood, subway lines threading beneath streets that had once carried only carriages, the entire rhythm of the city accelerating year after year. Emilie, watching this transformation from across an ocean, chose instead a life that moved considerably more slowly, deliberately stepping outside the very current of relentless change that had once swept her so abruptly into a scandal she never fully chose for herself. There is one more woman waiting in this history, and her story does not end the way the last 2 chapters might have led you to expect. Not every woman who outlived her fortune's original owner also outlived the century's judgment of her. Rest a while longer before we meet her, because her story is a gentler warning than the 2 you have just heard, and it deserves to be told without hurry. It is worth pausing once more, here in the quiet space between Emilie's long English decades and the 3rd and final woman waiting just ahead, to consider why this history has chosen to end with a story that does not resolve the way the first 2 did. It would have been easy enough to close this account after only 2 women, both of whom found, in their own very different ways, genuine security on the far side of scandal. That would have made for a tidier hour, a more satisfying arc, a lesson that could be summarized in a single confident sentence. Patience and discretion, in this particular century, tended to reward the women who practiced them. It would also honestly have been an incomplete account, because it is not entirely true. The woman waiting in the next chapter practiced a version of the same patience, accepted the same kinds of gifts, navigated the same fundamental arithmetic this story has spent all night explaining, and she still lost. Her story belongs here not to undercut everything you have already heard, but to complete it, to show the arithmetic's actual boundaries, rather than pretending it functioned as a guarantee. There is a kind of honesty in ending this way that a tidier structure would have sacrificed. Real history rarely offers 3-for-3 outcomes. It offers instead a pattern that holds most of the time, shaped by circumstances individual enough that no single rule can fully account for every case. 2 women secured their futures through patience and discretion. A third did everything similarly and still found herself, decades later, buried with only 3 mourners in attendance. Both outcomes are true, both belong in this account. Let this brief pause settle before the final story begins. There is no need to brace yourself for tragedy exactly. Josie Mansfield's life, however difficult its final chapters, was not without its own moments of genuine comfort and even genuine joy. But it is worth entering her story with slightly different expectations than the ones you carried into the first 2, because her story asks something different of you than Triumph does. It asks simply for honest attention, and for the particular kind of compassion that difficult, unresolved stories deserve just as much as the tidier ones do. Not every story tonight ends the way Arabella's did, or even the way Emilie's quiet English decades eventually did. It is worth telling this next one carefully, because a story of patient women outlasting their circumstances is only half true if it leaves out the women for whom patience in the end was not enough. Her name, professionally, is Josie Mansfield, though the name she was born with, Helen Josephine, belonged to a childhood considerably harder than the glamour that would later surround her. Her father is murdered in California while she's still a child. Her mother remarries more than once to men who bring instability rather than security into the household. One stepfather is abusive. Josie herself marries young, an actor named Frank Lawler, in what appears to have been, at least in part, an attempt to secure some protection from the chaos surrounding her, rather than a match built on lasting affection. The marriage ends in divorce. By 1867, in her early 20s, she finds herself in New York. impoverished enough that she owns only a single presentable dress and cannot pay the overdue rent on a small room on Lexington Avenue. It is a familiar shape by now in this history, a young woman with no fortune, no family able or willing to protect her, navigating a city that offered very few respectable paths forward for someone in her exact position. The man who changes her circumstances is James Fisk, known across New York as Jubilee Jim, a financier and Erie Railroad director whose flamboyance and considerable wealth made him one of the most recognizable figures on Wall Street. He first sees Josie at the home of a mutual friend, and by several accounts pursues her for months before she finally allows him to pay her overdue rent, an arrangement that quickly grows into something far more extensive. What follows will sound by now familiar in its outline, though the details are their own. Fisk purchases Josie an elegant 4-story brownstone, spending an estimated $65,000 on improvements alone, staffs it with servants, and fills her jewellery case with gifts that read, even at this distance, as almost theatrically extravagant. $50,000 in cash, roughly $250,000 in Tiffany emeralds, a diamond necklace, a tiara, pearls, and some 25 rings, acquired across just a handful of years. You will notice, comparing this arrangement to Arabella's or Emilie's, that the shape of the gift-giving looks nearly identical. A house, deeded and furnished. Jewellery, placed directly into her possession. Cash, delivered outright, with no strings attached to any eventual will or estate. By every principle this story has spent the night establishing, Josie Mansfield should have been just as financially secure as the two women who came before her in tonight's telling. But her story takes a different turn, and the turn begins with the second man. Edward Stokes, known to everyone as Ned, is Fisk's own business partner, and at some point during Josie's years with Fisk, an entanglement develops between Josie and Stokes as well, one that grows increasingly public and increasingly volatile. Fisk, discovering the affair, confronts Stokes directly, asking him to end whatever relationship had developed. Stokes refuses, insisting the choice should belong to Josie herself. Josie, for her part, declines to choose at all, suggesting instead, with a kind of breezy confidence that the Century found scandalous, that all three of them might simply remain friends. The arrangement does not hold. Accusations of extortion follow on both sides, along with lawsuits, stolen letters, and a rapidly escalating rivalry between the two men that culminates, in January of 1872, in violence. Stokes shoots Fisk on the staircase of the Grand Central Hotel, and Fisk dies from his wounds not long afterward, leaving behind a wife, a business empire in turmoil, and a mistress whose entire financial security had, until that moment, depended on his continued goodwill. This is where Josie's path diverges sharply from Arabella's and Emilie's. She does not quietly retain what had already been given to her, and simply wait out the scandal in comfortable obscurity. Instead, she sues Fisk's widow Lucy for $200,000, claiming it was money Fisk had owed her beyond what she had already received. It is, in its own way, an understandable decision. A woman asserting a claim she believed was rightfully hers, refusing to simply accept whatever had already been given and disappear quietly. But it is also, in the arithmetic this story has spent all night establishing, precisely the wrong move. Recall the mechanism. A gift, already given, already transferred, already sitting in a woman's own name, is untouchable, because the giving is already complete and requires no further legal action to defend. But a lawsuit is a different matter entirely. A lawsuit invites scrutiny. It drags private arrangements into open court, where a jury, a judge, and an entire newspaper-reading public are invited to weigh in on exactly how much a kept woman deserved, and whether she deserved anything at all. Josie's lawsuit does exactly this, and the public verdict, delivered through newspapers eager for scandal, is almost uniformly hostile. She loses the case. Whatever additional money she believed Fisk owed her, the court does not agree, and the newspapers, rather than sympathizing with a woman fighting for what she considered rightfully hers, treat the entire episode as confirmation of exactly the kind of grasping, disreputable character they had already assumed her to be. She travels to Boston afterward, where crowds follow her through the streets, hooting and jeering. When she attempts to testify in a related court proceeding later that year, she's refused accommodation at one hotel, then another, and when she finally takes a seat in the courtroom itself, several of the women present rise and walk out rather than share the room with her. It is a punishment considerably harsher and considerably more public than anything Arabella or Emilie ever faced, and it is worth asking why. Part of the answer lies in the lawsuit itself. By contesting the estate publicly, Josie invited a level of scrutiny that Arabella's quiet remarriage and Emilie's quiet retreat to England had both, deliberately or not, managed to avoid. Part of it lies simply in circumstance, in the very public and very violent nature of Fisk's death, which turned Josie's private arrangement into a matter of intense national fascination in a way neither Arabella's nor Emilie's situations ever quite became. She marries again eventually, and that marriage too ends badly in a divorce that leaves her, by most accounts, in reduced and increasingly private circumstances for the remainder of her life. And yet, remarkably, given everything that had gone wrong, she still outlives Fisk by nearly 6 decades. She dies in 1931, at 83 years old, having collapsed suddenly in a department store from what turns out to be stomach cancer. Only 3 people attend her funeral. Sit with that number for a moment. Against everything else this chapter has just told you. 3 people, at the funeral of a woman whose face and name had once filled every newspaper in the country, whose jewels had once been valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, who had in her own way been given every single financial advantage that secured Arabella's and Emilie's long, comfortable lives. The gifts were the same in kind, the outcome was not. Josie Mansfield outlived James Fisk by 59 years, precisely the same span of time Emilie Grigsby would later outlive Charles Yerkes. But where Emilie's 59 years passed in quiet, comfortable English obscurity, Josie's passed in a slow, grinding decline that no amount of jewellery or cash, however generously given at the outset, was ultimately able to prevent. It is worth asking gently at this late hour what actually made the difference. It was not the size of the gifts, which were, if anything, more extravagant in Josie's case than either of the others. It was not simply luck, though luck certainly played some part in every story this night has told. It seems to have been instead something closer to exposure, the decision to sue rather than simply hold, to demand a public accounting rather than quietly retain what had already irrevocably been given. There is a further piece of this worth considering, one the other 2 women's stories did not require you to sit with quite so directly. Josie's downfall was entangled not simply with a will or an estate, but with a murder, a spectacle so public and so violent that it swallowed every private, quieter question about her finances entirely. Nobody reading about a fatal shooting on a hotel staircase pauses to consider the technical distinction between an executed gift and a probate claim. The scale of the scandal itself made the underlying arithmetic invisible, buried under headlines far more dramatic than the ledger ever was. This is worth remembering as its own kind of lesson, distinct from the ones already offered tonight. Sometimes the arithmetic that should have protected a woman gets overwhelmed by circumstance entirely unrelated to the arithmetic itself. Josie did not lose her security because she misunderstood how gifts and wills worked. She lost a portion of it because the 2 men whose attention she divided between them ultimately could not resolve their rivalry except through violence, and the aftermath of that violence consumed every quieter question that might otherwise have worked in her favour. This is the harder, less comfortable lesson tucked inside tonight's larger arithmetic. Patience protected Arabella and Emilie in ways that assertion, however justified, did not protect Josie. It is not a fair lesson. It was not a fair century, but it is, as honestly as this history can tell it, what the record actually shows. It is worth pausing, too, on the particular position Josie occupied in the years immediately following the murder, before her lawsuit and its aftermath fully unfolded. She was, for a brief window, one of the most famous women in America, her face reproduced in countless newspaper engravings, her name spoken in parlours across the country that had never once received her. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of fame, worth noticing at this late hour. A woman known everywhere and welcomed nowhere, her notoriety indistinguishable to the public consuming it from any genuine achievement or virtue she might otherwise have possessed. Consider, too, how differently this fame served her compared to Arabella's eventual respectability or Emilie's quiet English obscurity. Arabella's later prominence was built, deliberately, on philanthropy and expertise. converted over decades into something the public eventually chose to admire. Emilie's obscurity was chosen, a deliberate retreat from a fame that had brought her nothing but scrutiny. Josie's fame, by contrast, was neither built nor chosen. It simply happened to her, the byproduct of two men's fatal rivalry, and it followed her for the rest of her long life whether she wanted it or not, an identity imposed from outside that she could never quite set down. It is worth remembering, too, the earlier hardships that shaped Josie long before Fisk ever entered her life. A father murdered when she was still a child, a stepfather whose cruelty drove her into a marriage chosen more for protection than affection, a mother whose own instability offered little in the way of steady guidance. She arrived at Fisk's door already carrying considerably more difficulty than either Arabella or Emilie had faced at a comparable age, and it is worth wondering whether that accumulated hardship shaped the choices that followed. The entanglement with Stokes, the refusal to simply choose between two men rather than risk losing both, the eventual decision to sue rather than quietly accept what had already been given. A woman who has already lost a great deal may reasonably calculate differently than a woman who has more still left to lose. There is a final, harder question worth sitting with before this chapter closes, one this history cannot fully answer but should not avoid asking. Might Josie have fared better had she simply held what she had and said nothing? The arithmetic this story has traced all night suggests she might have, but it is worth remembering too that the $200,000 she sued for was not an unreasonable sum to believe she was owed, and that a century which offered women almost no formal recourse for broken promises left few paths available beyond the courts, however badly those courts ultimately treated her. Patience protected the women who could afford to wait quietly. It is worth asking gently whether Josie, still in her 20s and newly widowed of a relationship rather than a marriage, could have afforded that particular kind of patience at all. It is worth noting too a small and largely overlooked detail about Josie's final years that offers at least a modest counterweight to the department store ending. She continued by several accounts to maintain a genuine interest in the arts throughout her later decades, attending theatre when her circumstances allowed it, retaining something of the cultured sensibility that had first drawn attention to her as a young woman in New York. A reduced life is not necessarily an empty one, and it is worth resisting the temptation to read her final years as pure tragedy simply because they lacked the dramatic vindication this story's other two women eventually found. Let this chapter close quietly now, without resolution, because Josie Mansfield's story does not offer one. Simply let her rest, an old woman collapsing in a department store on an ordinary afternoon in 1931, having spent 83 years navigating a world that never once made its rules fully visible to her, or to any of the women in tonight's story, until it was already far too late to do anything but live out whatever the arithmetic had already decided. 3 women, 3 fortunes given to them not by law, not by inheritance, not by any of the formal machinery the Gilded Age had built to move money from one generation to the next, but simply by the ordinary, day-to-day generosity of men who could give however much they liked, whenever they liked, without asking anyone's permission first. Arabella Huntington took that generosity and built, across 4 decades and 2 marriages, one of the great fortunes and one of the great cultural institutions of the American West, a library and garden that still stands, still welcomes visitors, still teaches children about a century she helped define from its quietest, least respectable margins. Emilie Grigsby took the same kind of generosity and simply held it, patiently, for nearly 6 decades, asking for nothing more once the giving had stopped, content to let time itself do the work of outlasting every person and every institution that had once judged her. Josie Mansfield took the same generosity, in even greater quantity, and lost almost everything that mattered anyway, not through carelessness, but through the simple, human, understandable decision to demand a public accounting for what she believed she was owed, in a century that punished exactly that kind of demand from exactly that kind of woman. What do these 3 lives taken together actually tell you about the Gilded Age, beyond the individual details of mansions and jewels and lawsuits that have carried you through the last several hours? Perhaps this, that the century's formal rules, the wills, the estates, the legal protections of marriage, were never quite as solid as they appeared from the outside, and were never quite as available to everyone as the wives who believed in them assumed. You have now met across 2 separate tellings of this history, Several wives who trusted entirely in those formal rules and discovered too late that trust alone could not protect them. Mary Yerkes, Anna Gould, the countless women bound by coverture and blind faith in a husband's honesty. Their claims were, on paper, the strongest available to any woman in this century. And paper, it turns out, burns rather easily when the man who wrote it has already spent everything it promised. The women in tonight's story held no such paper claims at all. They held something smaller, quieter, and in certain specific circumstances considerably more durable. The plain, simple fact of a gift already given, already transferred, already beyond anyone's power to take back. It was not a fair system. It did not reward virtue or love or even particular cleverness in any consistent way, as Josie's story makes painfully clear. It rewarded mostly timing, restraint, and the quiet good fortune of having attached yourself to a man whose wealth happened to be real rather than mortgaged into invisibility. There is no tidy moral to extract from this, and it would be dishonest to pretend there is one. The century that produced these three stories was not, in the end, interested in fairness at all. It was interested in appearances, in performance, in the careful maintenance of a social order that punished women publicly for exactly the same private arrangements it quietly tolerated among the men who created them. Arabella's eventual respectability, Emilie's quiet English exile, Josie's public humiliation, none of these outcomes were assigned according to any principle more elevated than circumstance, timing, and the particular temperament of the woman living through them. And yet something in these stories still resists the neat, cynical conclusion that nothing mattered but luck. Look again at what each woman actually did, across the small, unremarkable decisions that filled most of their days. Arabella nursed a dying woman with genuine, sustained patience long before there was any fortune to inherit. Emilie remained steady at a dying man's bedside through 5 weeks of illness in a foreign country, asking for nothing beyond what had already been given. Even Josie, in her own more turbulent way, simply kept living, kept working, kept surviving 83 years of a century that never once made things easy for her. Patience, it turns out, was not a guarantee of anything, but it was, in 2 out of these 3 stories, the thing that mattered most, more than beauty, more than the size of the original gift, more even than the eventual size of the fortune itself. A woman who could wait, who did not need the world's immediate approval, who understood that time itself was working slowly on her behalf, even when every visible sign suggested otherwise, tended to end up decades later, standing quietly in a room the century had once insisted she would never be allowed to enter. The physical world these 3 women moved through has mostly disappeared now. The Fifth Avenue mansion with its platinum doors is gone, replaced first by a garden, and then by whatever came after the garden. The Park Avenue house of mystery is gone. The brownstone Fisk furnished for Josie Mansfield is gone. Only the Huntington library remains standing in anything resembling its original form, still holding its books, still tending its gardens, a permanent structure built, in the end, out of exactly the patient accumulation this whole story has been quietly tracing. There is something worth carrying with you, as this long night finally winds down, in the simple fact that the loudest, most visible fortunes of this century, the platinum doors, the pink marble palace, the 300 gowns worn once and discarded, are almost entirely gone now, while the quieter, less celebrated accumulations built slowly and without much fanfare by women, the century never intended to remember, in a handful of cases outlasted them all. It does not undo the unfairness. It does not erase the closed doors, the public humiliations, the 3 mourners at a funeral that should have drawn hundreds. But it does suggest, gently, at this late hour, that the century's judgment of who deserved to be remembered was not in the end the only judgment that mattered. Time itself kept a separate ledger, and in a few quiet, unexpected corners of this story, that ledger came out very differently than anyone watching at the time could possibly have predicted. Think back once more over the full shape of everything you have heard tonight. 3 girls, none of them born to money, one losing her father in a Richmond boarding house, one growing up inside a carefully guarded family secret, one navigating a childhood scattered across 3 unstable households before she was even old enough to understand why. None of them chose the century they were born into, or the rules it had already written for women in their position before they ever arrived. And yet each of them, in her own way, found a narrow passage through those rules, a passage the century had never intended to leave open. Two of them walked all the way through it, into decades of security nobody could easily take back. One of them found the passage and then, through a very human and very understandable insistence on being treated fairly, lost her footing on the way through. There is no formula here, no tidy set of instructions that would have guaranteed any of these women a better outcome than the one she received. Life rarely offers formulas, and a story that pretended to extract one from these three lives would be doing them a disservice. What it offers instead, more honestly, is simply a record. 3 women, 3 sets of choices, 3 very different endings, all of them shaped by a century that never once made its own rules fully visible to the people living inside them. That perhaps is the truest thing this long night has had to say. The rules were never visible, not to Mary Yerkes, believing in a fortune that had already quietly dissolved, not to Anna Gould, signing budgets she never fully understood, not even, in her own way, to Arabella, Emilie or Josie, each of them navigating by instinct and hard experience rather than any clear map anyone had bothered to draw for them. They simply did what people in impossible circumstances have always done. They paid attention, as carefully as they could, to whatever small piece of the world was actually within their reach, and let the larger unfairness of the century remain, mostly beyond their control. It is worth remembering, too, that this arithmetic did not disappear along with the century that produced it. The specific mechanisms have changed considerably. Modern law offers far more protection to wives, far more transparency in marriage, far fewer of the blunt legal exclusions that once left women entirely at the mercy of a husband's goodwill or a trustee's discretion. But the underlying human pattern this story has traced all night, the difference between a promise and something already irrevocably given, still shapes financial lives today in quieter, less dramatic ways than a mansion on Fifth Avenue or a library in San Marino. Perhaps that is the gentlest place to leave this story, as the night finally winds all the way down, not as a lesson about the Gilded Age specifically, though it is certainly that, but as a small, patient reminder that security, in any century, tends to be built less from grand promises and more from the quiet accumulation of small, completed things. A gift given, a kindness offered without expectation of return, a patience that does not need to announce itself to anyone watching. Think one final time of the 3 houses this story opened inside, a Richmond boarding house long since gone, a Park Avenue mansion the newspapers once called the House of Mystery, demolished decades ago along with almost everything else on that particular block. A brownstone on West 24th Street, furnished once with Tiffany emeralds and 25 rings, gone now too, replaced by whatever the city eventually needed more than it needed to remember a scandal from 1868. Only the library remains standing in California sunlight, holding its books and its gardens open to anyone who cares to walk through the gate. It is worth returning one final time to the image this story opened with. 2 households on the same evening, each one holding a woman who did not yet know how her own story would end. That image was drawn specifically from the Yerkes household, but it could just as easily have described any of the 3 women you have spent tonight with. Arabella in her sick room, not yet knowing a fortune waited decades ahead. Emilie in her convent school, not yet knowing what her brother's introduction would eventually set in motion. Josie in her single presentable dress on Lexington Avenue, not yet knowing which of the 2 men circling her would determine the shape of the rest of her long life. None of them could see forward. All any of them could do was attend carefully to whatever was directly in front of them, and trust that the accumulated weight of those careful attentions would eventually add up to something. For 2 of them, it did. For one, it did not in the way she hoped, though even her story told honestly offers its own kind of unglamorous instruction. Together, the 3 of them offer something more useful than any single triumphant fable could have provided alone, a genuine, complicated record of what actually happened to women who found themselves, through no particular fault or virtue of their own, standing just outside the rules a wealthy century had written to exclude them. It is worth acknowledging, too, before this long chapter closes, how much of this story has necessarily been reconstruction rather than certainty. The women themselves left few letters, fewer diaries, almost nothing in their own words describing what any of this actually felt like from the inside. What survives are property records, newspaper accounts written by men who mostly despised or pitied them, court filings, the occasional interview given late in life to a reporter more interested in scandal than in truth. This history has done its best to read between those lines carefully, honestly, without inventing feelings or motivations the record cannot support. But it is worth remembering, as you drift towards sleep, that the real women behind these three names were considerably more complicated, more contradictory, more fully human than any hour-long telling could possibly capture. It is worth remembering, finally, that this story is only one small corner of a much larger history. The history of coverture's slow dismantling, of women's property rights expanding decade by decade through statute after statute, of a legal architecture that eventually, over the better part of a century, came to recognize what these three women already understood through hard, private experience. The formal law caught up eventually. It always does, eventually, though rarely quickly enough to help the women who lived through its slowest years. Arabella, Emilie, and Josie were not waiting for the law to change. They were simply doing what people in impossible positions have always done, finding whatever narrow passage the world left open to them, and walking through it as carefully as they knew how. That, perhaps, is the final quiet lesson this long night has to offer. Houses fall, scandals fade. Even fortunes, however carefully guarded, eventually pass out of any single family's hands and into whatever the following century decides to do with them. What sometimes remains, against every expectation the original century held, is simply the patient, careful record of a woman who understood, long before anyone else was willing to say it plainly, that a gift already given is worth more than a promise still waiting to be kept. It is worth carrying one final thought forward as we prepare to close this long night entirely. The century that shaped these three lives is gone now, its rules mostly dismantled, its scandals mostly forgotten by everyone except the occasional historian willing to sift back through the newspaper archives. But the underlying human situation these women navigated, the gap between what a person is promised and what a person actually, securely possesses, has never fully disappeared. It simply wears different clothes now in different centuries, waiting patiently for anyone paying close enough attention to notice it. Before the lamps go out entirely, it is worth taking one last quiet walk through where these three women's stories physically ended, because the geography of an ending sometimes says as much as the story itself. Arabella rests in the mausoleum at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, beside the second husband who once shared her passion for collecting, her name still spoken today by docents leading visitors through the gardens and reading rooms she helped build. It is, by any measure, a resting place of genuine permanence, maintained, funded, visited by thousands of people every year who have no idea of the Richmond boarding house or the Fifth Avenue sick room that eventually led her there. Emilie's final resting place is considerably harder to trace, tucked away somewhere in the English countryside she chose to call home for nearly 6 decades, unmarked by any grand memorial, unvisited by any regular stream of curious tourists. This, too, feels fitting for a woman who spent her later life deliberately choosing quiet over spectacle, security over recognition, a life fully lived rather than a legacy loudly announced. Josie Mansfield's grave, if it survives at all in any identifiable form, holds no comparable prominence either, a modest marker for a woman whose name once filled every newspaper in the country, and who died, in the end remembered by almost no one beyond the 3 mourners who attended her funeral. There is something worth sitting with in that particular kind of forgetting. Not cruelty exactly, simply the ordinary erosion that time visits on even the most sensational stories, once enough decades have passed and enough newer scandals have arrived to take their place in the public imagination. 3 women, 3 very different final addresses, a library that still teaches, a grave that history has quietly lost track of, a resting place shared with almost no one who remembers why it matters. It is worth letting all 3 images settle together now, without ranking them, without insisting that one ending was better or more deserved than the others. They simply are what they are, the true physical conclusion of 3 long, complicated lives that this history has done its best across one long night to tell honestly. Somewhere tonight a gardener is tending the camellias at the Huntington Library, unaware of most of what you have just heard. Somewhere an English churchyard holds a name that means nothing to anyone walking past it. Somewhere a cemetery record from 1931 sits quietly in an archive, waiting for anyone curious enough to go looking. All 3 places exist right now, exactly as this story has described them, holding the quiet, unglamorous remainder of 3 lives that once mattered enormously to the people living them, and matter now mostly to whoever takes the time to remember. It is worth letting one final image settle before the lamps go out entirely. 3 women, born decades apart, dying decades apart, each carrying inside her the same quiet, patient arithmetic this story has spent all night tracing. None of them set out to teach any lesson. They simply lived, as carefully and as fully as their circumstances allowed, inside a century that never once made its own rules fully visible to them. That, perhaps, is enough of a legacy for anyone, simply to have lived carefully inside difficulty, and to have left behind, however faintly, a record honest enough that someone, generations later, could still tell the truth about what actually happened. Let all of it go quiet now. The ledgers, the safes, the lawsuits, the long Atlantic crossings. None of it needs to be carried any further tonight. Somewhere, a library in California is closing its reading room for the evening, the last lamp dimming over a table of books that outlasted every drawing room that once refused to receive the woman who collected them. Somewhere, an English house has gone dark for the night, its rooms holding nothing louder now than the quiet settling of an old house at rest. Somewhere, a Richmond boarding house that no longer exists once held a girl who had no way of knowing what would come. You do not need to know what comes next either. You only need to let the evening carry you the way it always eventually does. Somewhere, a brownstone on a New York street that has long since been rebuilt into something else entirely, once held 25 rings in a jewellery case, and jewels that meant everything for a while, and then, slowly, meant nothing at all, the way even the brightest things eventually settle into the quiet dark of an ordinary closed drawer. None of the ledgers matter now. None of the wills, the safes, the courtrooms, the closed doors. They have all gone the way everything from that century eventually goes, quiet, distant, folded into the soft dark of a story already told. The gowns are put away, the lamps are low, the century that once seemed so loud and so certain of its own rules has gone almost entirely quiet, and so, now can you. Somewhere, 3 women who never met each other are, in whatever way stories allow the dead to rest, finally resting together tonight. Their 3 very different endings folded quietly into the same long, unhurried telling. There is nothing more they need from you now, only your own rest, arriving in its own time, the way it always does. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders rest fully into whatever is holding you. There is nothing left to add up tonight. The ledger is closed. Sleep now. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you're still awake, I'd love to know, of the 3 women in tonight's story, which one would you have wanted to sit with for an evening? Let me know in the comments, along with where in the world you're listening from tonight.